some follow-up for tonight. Basically, tonight is all follow-up, and ultimately, we're hopeful that if you're ready and comfortable, we can get some direction from you that obviously would help us to bring the budget and a lot of its major nuances to, in the process of closing it up and getting it ready for formal consideration. One of those homework assignments is with regard to inviting Ms. Graves here tonight to go through the study that her company authored, and that essentially was put on hold for the last year in terms of its implementation. Many of you, probably all of you, have read the report, but only some of you have actually seen the presentation as of a year or more ago. And so Ms. Graves was kind enough to spend some time with us this evening to give that presentation and allow for the opportunity to ask some questions. I'm not sure that at the conclusion of her presentation we necessarily need direction on that aspect of tonight's homework follow-up, if you will. But certainly with regard to many of the other pieces and parts that kind of fit together, we're hopeful that we can get some guidance and go from there. But we are certainly prepared to hold other discussions and meetings as we need to. So with that, Mr. Mayor, if I could defer to Ms. Graves and Tracy, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, Ms. Graves.
All right. Good afternoon. Thank you for letting me join your meeting. I'm going to share my screen and go through, as was mentioned, a brief overview of the compensation study that we did a little more than a year ago now. And this is really the same presentation that was provided then. It's just been cut down a little bit so that we don't take you through all of the detail that many of you may have already seen. I think this covers all of the salient points. So let me share my screen. We'll make sure this works. Is that visible to you?
Yep.
Are you, and the audio is okay? I just want to make sure.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, well, good. So again, this is just a review of the findings and recommendations that came out of the market study that Graves Consulting completed. Really Q1 of last year is when that was wrapping up. And we're going to go through kind of just the high level overview of what we covered, what the process steps were, kind of how we got there, and then a very high level overview of our findings. And then I think Tracy is actually going to share a little bit of what's coming next from an implementation plan perspective. So the intent and the scope of the project, I think probably this is familiar to everybody. Clearly, it's critically important for the city to be able to recruit and retain top talent and make sure, and one of the primary ways of doing that is making sure that you're competitive to market. And in addition to competitive to market, I do think it's worth pointing out that a pay system that is as objective and as transparent as possible is also really a big draw for employees. They need to know not just what they're going to be paid, but why and how it was calculated and how they can impact it. And I feel like that's what we've provided here. Our scope was to provide recommendations to the city to update the pay structure and additionally to look at benefits. And so that we're taking kind of a total comp approach and comparing that to statistically valid market data from a defined market area. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So it was building all of that, making the recommendations, and then going further and talking about implementation and ongoing maintenance, right? Our goal is always when we complete a project for a client to give you everything you need to be able to internally manage that system for years to come so that you don't have to go back out and spend money on consultants on a regular basis. So I'm going to go through kind of a couple of slides here that's a high-level overview of the process that we undertook. Now, this was about, if I recall, probably a 5 to 6 month process. So I'm condensing a lot of work into a couple of slides, but these are really the heavy hitters. So we kicked the project off by meeting with the full leadership team to really make sure we understood, even having gone through, kind of the RFP process, understand deeply the current state of where the city's at from a compensation, what were the specific concerns that have come up that led you to seek to have a market study done, and then really to get in depth into an understanding of all of the positions that exist within your city so that when we go out and pull benchmark information, we really deeply understand the jobs enough to make sure that we're benchmarking them appropriately. Right? We Another really foundational element of this project, and we spent a good deal of time on it, was determining what the defined market could and should look like for the city. Who were the municipalities and or other employers that you would compare yourselves to make sure that what you had was a broad enough view of market to get statistically valid data, and to make sure that when you say we know where we're positioned to market, that you can really confidently say that. So we spent a good deal of time on that, and we selected a fairly broad regional area that included municipalities and employers within Wyoming and also in several surrounding states. So what we ended up with, again, we know that not every city has exactly the same positions. So you need to have a large enough group that you get statistically valid data for as many of them as you can. We also met individually with each department head and also with employee groups and teams to really dig into the positions. Again, we looked at job descriptions, we looked at org charts, but in our view, nothing really replaces a discussion with a leader to make sure we fully understand the span and scope and the expectations of a position. In addition to that, we deployed a position description questionnaire, fairly lengthy, in-depth document that many internal employees, over 100, filled out to really help us understand the nuance of some of those jobs. That is really important, not only for understanding how to benchmark them, but understanding the best way to organize them on your pay structure. We also shared a similar project overview to what we're talking with the City Council, and also provided information to all of the employees at the onset of the project and at the end, so that people could fully appreciate the time and the rigor that the city was going through to ensure that they really had competitive pay, right? You're doing a really comprehensive process, and you want to make sure that your employees understand how seriously you take it. And so I remember that was when we could still come on site. Came on site and did multiple meetings in multiple locations and got really good feedback from a pretty engaged group of employees. From that, what we did was we designed and deployed a customized survey tool. So we reached out to all of those organizations and municipalities that were included in the defined market. We chose 42 specific positions across the city at varying levels and encompassing all of the departments. And we called these kind of benchmark positions, and we collected data from your defined market for those positions. We used all of that data, right, that we talked about from the custom survey, and we had really good participation in that survey. Generally you do when employers can get access to survey data for only the cost involved in completing it. Normally we get pretty good reaction, and we did. So we used that as kind of our basis, but we supplemented that with some pretty robust data from Employers Council, which is an organization that has a lot of municipalities in Colorado. We selected a handful in the northern Colorado area that we thought were comparable. And we actually also have a little bit of other existing survey data. So we tried to take as wide a view as we could. And when we looked at data, if we had both respondents from the custom survey and information from Employers Council on the same job, we used the data from the custom survey as it was going to be the most recent, right? So that data that we were pulling, what we were collecting, were actual wages being paid to employees doing very similar work for these positions, right? So we aren't just collecting pay ranges, right? How does your range compare to their range? We were actually asking for what is the pay of your incumbents doing that work? And again, did that matching based on all of the data gathering we had done to that point to fully understand the jobs. We did also, and I think this is important, we geographically adjusted the data from a cost of living perspective to Casper, because we know as we broadened your defined market to look out, that there were some that had very different cost of living, some lower, some higher. So we used data from Economic Research Institute, that's what ERI is, which is publicly available data on cost of living differences. And we made those adjustments to make sure that it was an apples to apples comparison. We did, as we benchmark jobs, we sometimes make adjustments to the span and the scope of a role. For instance, if you have a position that is a director level department head, there is a difference in span and scope between doing that in a city that employs 200 people or a city that employs 2,000 people. So occasionally we would make adjustments to benchmarks. There might be other positions where within the city you require a higher level of certification or a higher experience than what the data. So we might scope it up to account for that, right? So we make those professional judgments. And we were able to pull external market data for 153 of the positions that existed at the time within the city, which left us less than 40 to what we call slot, right? And when we say slot, what we're doing is we place them on the pay structure that we create based on their internal relative value to other positions that we already had solid market data on. So we felt like having market data for that high of a percentage of jobs gave us a really solid foundation for the structure that we were recommending. I'll pause for a second because sometimes I get on a roll, and when I can't see everybody, you might be trying to interject a question.
I do have a question.
Councilman, no.
When you were using the demographics to do this, was there any attention paid to the amount of funding or tax base that a particular city has? In other words, if you're using Northern Colorado, they're robust in tax money and we're not. So was that demographic used at all in any of your comparisons?
No, unfortunately it wasn't. And you know, that's a great question and it comes up a lot. The problem is that is not data that is readily available within the published survey information. I'm certain that it is something that could be ascertained, but we adjusted based on a cost of living, not necessarily on an ability to pay, which is I think what you're referring to.
It is, because I think it's a lot easier to pay your people more when you have more money in your coffers.
Sure, understood. And it's a very valid point. And you know, what I would say is our goal was to make sure that you had a deep understanding of what the market says, what the market rates are in your area. Obviously, what you do with that information and how fully you're able to implement and get to those numbers is certainly a function of your available budget.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else?
Nope, I think we're good.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll talk about the pay structures that we proposed. So we did propose one pay structure for all of what we would call general government positions, with a separate pay structure for sworn non-exempt police. So I'm going to talk first about the general government pay structure. And this is where we probably had one of the more significant departures from what your current state is, what was current state at the time, and I think still is. What we proposed was an open range structure that did not have predefined steps. And we did that specifically because we know that that provides greater flexibility, not just for implementation, but for ongoing maintenance, to be able to transition into a system that is an open range structure, meaning every job still has a pay grade. It has a minimum and a maximum that is still based around market value, but how somebody moves through that range can be based on affordability for the city, market movement, performance, any variety of things, so that the city is not locked into X% increase or X amount of dollars, because that's what it takes to fund the next step. Okay? The other thing that I think was pretty significant in the structure is that we widened the ranges pretty significantly. Most all of your ranges previously were 5 steps, and it was 22% wide, meaning from the minimum of the range to the maximum was 22%. What that had created was quite a bit of compression. Many people with varying levels of tenure and experience all earning the same amount of money because they had gotten to the top of the range, right? In a 5-step program, you get to this top in 5 years, and then you stay there. And the adjustments happen only when the entire range is shifted. So we widened those ranges to allow for more movement through the range and a greater ability for people to be not be as compressed. We also built a structure where each of the pay grades and ranges are 10% apart, meaning from midpoint of one range to midpoint of the next one is 10%. What you had before were around 5%, which created a significant amount of overlap, right? Many grades had the same dollar amount that would fall within it. So it was a little more differentiation. Simplifies the structure a little bit. You went from what was 53 pay grades down to 24. And they were not set out with separate bands. There was pay banding that existed before, so much greater flexibility. So the high level impact of this, and this is a slide, again, this is straight from the presentation from a year ago. So from a number of positions, this might be slightly different now because I'm sure the makeup of these positions has changed a little bit. But the impact at the time is that there were definitely positions within the city that changed what I would call relative position on your classification listing, meaning they are either higher or lower than positions before they might have been grouped in the same pay band with. And again, that was based on market value of that job, that having shifted and the market saying that job was either coming in a little higher or potentially coming in a little lower, right? The impact of that, when we calculated initial financial impact, was that you only had 3 positions that had incumbents that were below the minimum of the new range, right? And overall, what we found is that your jobs were really not dramatically off from market. They were simply narrow. They were very narrow, and it was difficult to get higher in the range as you had more tenure experience, and maybe sometimes harder to hire lower in the range for lower experienced people. But the city was not in a bad position as far as, you know, it being dramatically under market. There were 18 positions, which had a total at the time of about 43 people, that had current rates that were above the maximum of the new range, right? Not uncommon for either of these things to happen when a market study hasn't been done for a few years. And again, we would not recommend pulling people's pay back. These were simply ones that we would be what I would call red circle rates. And eventually, as the market shifted, they would catch up. And one of the nice things in this new structure was that at the time, there would have only been about 5 to 8% of your population that would be maxed out at the top of their pay grade versus what was currently 53%, right? So definitely increased that ability for people to not just be stuck at the max and then be compressed as everybody moved up behind them.
Hey, Lori.
Yes.
Real quick, the 53%, is that fairly typical as well, or is that unique in any sense?
Well, it is typical to have a percentage that is at the top of the range, particularly in government positions where people tend to stay. But 53 is probably one of the higher percentages I've seen. What I'm quoting to you is anecdotal based on my book of business, so you know I should caution with that. But I generally see 20 to 25% maxed out. And I really think that was primarily just a function of how narrow the ranges were.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Thank you. Lori, I just had a quick question. I don't understand wage compression very well, but my question, I guess, what is the possibility that new employees would make more than long-term employees with the same job description when it comes to that? Maybe you addressed that as I was writing my notes down, but is that something that we need to be concerned about?
Yes, it is. I think wage compression is something that exists everywhere and is a problem everywhere. And there are structural kind of system-based things you can do to lessen it. And the rest of it is a bit of a function of budget and market, right? But simply by way of having narrower ranges, what you know is that if it only takes me 5 years to get to the top, and then I'm going to be at the top for the next 15, then everybody else coming behind me is also going to get right to where I am. And when I'm at 20 years and somebody else is at 5, we're now making the same amount of money, right? So it's a very real thing that happens, and it happens more so when there's not as much room to move a little bit further up, right? It also happens in periods where, you know, unemployment gets low and wages rise quite a bit, and you're forced to hire people in at or even slightly above where current people are. And we talked about that a little bit in our study, this idea of making equity adjustments where you see compression becoming a problem.
Okay, perfect. That answers my question then. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So on this one, again, we've kind of talked about this. The wider ranges gives you more upside. The open range also eliminates what I would call front loading. You know, to me, the current system with 5 steps that were, if I recall, 5% apart. Those are really nice increases for your first 5 years, right? 5% plus maybe even COLA on top of that if the range moved. big increases and then down to nothing or just COLA at that point forward. So they were what I would call front loaded, and now it is set to be a much smoother, I think, path through the range. And again, implementation is significantly easier when you move from step to open range as opposed to vice versa. Because in a step plan, you would have to determine the step that every single employee should be on. That generally has a pretty large price tag, and it's hard to figure out who gets what when. In an open range plan, you have an ability, and I know that Tracy and her team have been working on this, to project out for the next few years what that path would be to identify people that are compressed or are lower than they should be, and simply give raises as budget allows. Okay, so we'll talk for just a second about the police. We talked about this idea. It is very common and still very common that sworn public safety police positions be on a separate structure from general government positions, really primarily because those markets don't tend to move the same, right? Public safety markets tend to move different, sometimes quicker than the market for general government. And if they're all on one pay structure, when you are trying to adjust your structure, you would either have to not move it as fast as market would say for police, or move it a little too fast for general government. So we like keeping them separate. It is also still much more common for public safety and particularly police positions to be on a step plan, and that is what we recommended for this one as well. We kept them all on a step plan. This is just the sworn non-exempt. Leadership positions and non-sworn positions would still sit on the regular open structure general government plan. The changes we made here were a little more subtle. We combined what was police officer and senior police officer into one 7-step system so that there was, again, a little more widening and a little more ability for officers to move up through that pay range. All of the minimums and maximums that we set were above where they currently were. So obviously this wasn't going to represent a decrease or a slowdown in pay for anyone. And we did make the additional steps 6 and 7 slightly less than the first 5, with the idea being you need to get officers in and get them up to market as quickly as possible. And then as you get higher in the range, slightly smaller increases are more appropriate. And again, this, even though it is a step plan, what we know is that that doesn't mean that anybody gets to say that's a guarantee, right? Budget is always going to drive that. So movement through the steps are budget dependent. They're not automatic. And I think that's something that we talked about having to address when you have an open range for general government and a step for public safety. It can feel like, oh, these are guaranteed, right, on the step plan, but they're really not. It's all going to be budget dependent. Questions on that before I move on? Nope. Okay. I think this next slide is for Tracy. I'm going to let you take it from here.
Stay on this one or that one?
Wherever you would like.
All right. So the next slide is going over our implementation, which we did at the end of the presentation in May that Lori gave. We came up with this implementation schedule. So the first phase was to increase the vacation accrual for newer employees and do a tool allowance for mechanics, which we did last July. And then this July, what we're proposing to do is slide all of the employees from our existing pay scale onto the grade pay scale. So with doing that, as she went through, you know, we have different costs that are associated, which really there's a small percentage of employees, 14 full-time in the general employee group, that would need to be brought up to the minimum, and that approximate cost is $20,010. And then we have 8 police officers that would need to be brought up to the minimum of that new scale, and that's approximately $19,615. And then we have an employer increase, or a share on the employer portion rather, to the Wyoming law enforcement pension just for sworn officers. That was one of the recommendations, to phase that in to be more competitive on that particular benefit. So the cost for that would be $87,500, with the grand fund total, or to the general fund, of $127,125. to do that implementation as of July 1. Now, as Lori spoke to the compression issues, that is something that needs further evaluation, and that's what Carter alluded to the other night. As far as that will be a totally different number that we would come back in January and tell you what that is. Right now we don't have an idea of what that number would be, but we know it exists, and that would be another ask in January is what we're proposing.
Mr. Manager?
Mr. Mayor, thank you. A couple things that I would add to what Tracy is representing to you tonight. That $127,000 figure is actually what I would consider your maximum exposure with regard to what that could cost us. In fact, I would call it even a worst case scenario figure. The fact is that it'll probably be less than that particular calculation would represent. Furthermore, I would suggest that in concert with understanding what that financial impact regarding compression would amount to post-implementation, I don't have a figure as to what that might be in January for us to bring forward for your consideration. But given that there, could ostensibly be an additional financial impact with regard to a compression consideration that you may want to look at and evaluate at that point in time, that would be the reason that if indeed we do have your support, we would also ask for, at that time, some consideration as it relates to getting employees started in their new wage scale with regard to a potential merit increase of some kind. I don't know what that would be at this point in time, because again, I want to weigh it against what that cost of compression, excuse me, what that cost of compression might include. But I am saying that if we do actual raises, again, and I call it merit, even though really it's probably more appropriate to call it wage advancement, until then, because those financial impacts will not be clear until we get past this point in time and have some history in our sales, if you will.
Councilman Gambros.
Thank you, Mayor. So I have a question about the $127,000. That is potential anticipated cost over the course of the next year, or is that, because in my mind, if we're taking a narrower pay scale, raising the minimums, increasing the maximum and the range, over the course of time, our wages are going to increase exponentially, at least a little bit, till we start getting people to max out in that upper range again, correct? If we have half of our people already maxed out, those half of the that 53% now have more room to earn above what they had earlier, right? So I'm seeing wages grow over the course of the next few years.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I would not, and I'm going to take a stab at that, and then if Tracy and Lori want to jump in, please do. I would not suggest that by implementing the Graves study, you are actually increasing employees' wages. I think in only a few instances are you actually increasing employees' wages, because we have determined that a few of them are not on par with market with regard to what they're being paid now. Okay, and that's where Tracy's numbers are coming from. The study does not say everybody deserves a 20% higher wage. Okay, all it says is this is what we think that band ought to look like in terms of their advancement through the band and a way in which that can happen, particularly when you're talking about general government. PD is a little different, as they mentioned, because what they're recommending is a real strict definition of how police progress through their wage bands, which is admittedly different than what they're recommending for general government. But I wouldn't say that your overall financial footprint for your employees is going to grow by some amount. The manner by which they get into their wages and travel through their bands is what is primarily different here. Tracy, Lori, would y'all disagree? What would you add to that?
I think it sounded correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so I agree. I think that's very well said. And really, that to me, that is the beauty and the appropriateness of an open range plan, because you do not have a predetermined path or speed at which people will move through the range. So yes, you have increased the potential of what they can earn within their range, but you are going to move them through that range based on, market drivers, budget, and performance. So you have that flexibility. And really, if you think about how I believe the system is functioning now, you were giving pay increases even for people that were at the top of the range by simply shifting the range. So it's really just a different mechanism that you're using. You're now, instead of shifting the whole range as much, you're shifting the ranges by a smaller amount and moving people through it. But the dollars and cents are still going to be primarily driven on your budget.
Thank you.
Councilmember Polk.
So we've got the 127,000 that we've heard about now, and then sort of a question mark, January 1. What of these values are represented in the budget we got on Monday? And would this come in the way of a budget amendment in January 1, or is there something already factored in?
Mr. Mayor, council member, very fair question. The only thing that's incorporated into your budget right now is with regard to the costs to implement. And that would be, worst case scenario, $127,000, which I would argue is a fairly cheap implementation cost. What is separate and apart from that cost would be what you all would consider in January or years thereafter in terms of how much you would want to invest in your employees to progress through their new wage bands. That could be in the form of a 1% merit. It could be in the form of a 3% merit. It could be in the form of a 5% step increase or whatever. You get to decide that, and that's the other reason I like this implementation, because for the most part, you get to take control back, if you will, of what it is you spend on your employees year in, year out.
Okay, so based on what you just said then, so if we adopt this and implement this, then the wage increases by percentage will become a yearly or every, twice a year council decision rather than, how is it happening now? Is that a city manager decision based on your employees, or now if we agree to a 1% pay increase, that's just a blanket pay increase? What are there changes in how those things are implemented with this system?
Mr. Mayor, council member, another great question. Currently, if we weren't on some sort of moratorium on wage increases right now, you are basically hamstrung to a 5% increase every single year for those employees that are within the current wage band structure. And so that really has been an issue of yes or no for council to consider, more so than how much.
I see.
Okay? So currently it is a 5% take it or leave it kind of a thing.
So it happens automatically unless we freeze it.
Unless you say no. That's right. And my position on that whole thing is that is a significantly challenging path to be on in terms of long-term sustainability, if indeed that happens every single year, unless you just overtly say no. Because that represents a huge, huge cost to not have control over.
Councilman Casper.
Along with this, and you're talking about your very specific stepped increases, will there be anything in here based on performance? So if you have a guy that's, well, let's say we take the people that are maxed out right now, and you have a 5-year Yeah, a 6-year and a 15-year employee. And the 6-year employee is still really not knowledge-wise, performance-wise up to where the 15-year employee is. Will you still be able to give, say, the 15-year employee a 3% raise and the 6-year employee a 1% raise?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Kathy, another great question. Councils prior to this one have weighed in on that question and have been resistant to the idea of paying employees pursuant to their performance. Okay? So the answer to that is we do not have a performance-based system in place. I would like to defer, however, to Lori or Tracy to talk to the matter as it relates to an implementation with Graves, if I could. That's all right.
So yeah, I'm happy to field that, and then Tracy, jump in. So what I would say is, yeah, what you're describing is exactly the type of compression that we're trying to deal with, right? Because when you have a range that only is so wide and you get to the top in 5 years, you absolutely are going to have a 6-year and a 15-year person at the same place. By widening these ranges and then by allowing that to be open structure, what that means and what I think is going to happen over the next few years, and Tracy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is assessing people individually to say, okay, if this is the pay range that you're in, because this represents market, how much tenure and experience do you really have in this role, and where should you be in the range? And how do I compare that to where you are? And you will identify groups of people who, not based on performance, but simply based on tenure and experience, should be higher in the range than they are. So in future budget cycles, as you're making pay increases, my recommendation in the program was to have a set amount, whatever your budget is, to pull back a piece of that budget and be able to take some of that money to apply to the people that you have identified as being too low in the range based on their tenure and experience. And that's how you slowly, over time, probably several budget cycles, move the people who need to be up in the range, and that's what begins to relieve compression. That does not have to be based on performance, and I should caveat this by saying my personal opinion and my preference is not to make it based on performance. I don't think that directly tying performance to this type of a pay system is terribly effective. It is very difficult to calibrate your raters. It's very difficult to determine good performance from bad on a comparable scale. And when your budget is really only large enough to keep pace with market, it's difficult to call that a performance-based pay increase when mostly your pay increases, even your highest ones for top performers, are probably only meeting market.
The only other thing that I would add is that, gosh, I just lost my thought. I had it. It had to do with, the flexibility of this pay scale. That's one of the things we like, is because we did let employees know that it does have the potential to adapt to a pay for performance system easier than what we currently have. So even though right now, that's not what we're recommending, knowing that, people change on councils and city managers, that if in the future that was something that was recommended to move forward, this system would easily adapt to that as well.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Yeah, I think that just goes back to my earlier statement, and maybe I'll just make this statement. I think that this makes me feel a little bit better if there is an avenue for us to figure out a way for that discrepancy between, people that have been here longer in the same positions, and if there's opportunities for us to do equity adjustments, I think that that's going to be something that's going to be looked at based upon limitations on the budget, obviously. We understand that part of it. My only fear is if we do have limitations on the budget and we have one person that is making more in the job, that's going to be the tricky point that could cause some issues. I don't see it being a lot of that happening, but I think we just have to make sure that we have to kind of keep an eye on that. So, yeah.
Councilman Kathy.
Well, the reason I brought that question up about the evaluation performance is, coming from private business, I can have two different people that have been on the same job 10 years. One of them has 10 years of experience. The other person has had 1 year 10 different times. And there is no way that that latter should be getting the same money that the former. And that's what bothers me. And that's why I brought that up.
Tracy?
The way that I think that should be addressed is by management of those type of performance issues outside of compensation. And we did just roll out our employee development plan this January, and I think that will help deal with those issues.
Okay, anybody else?
Thank you for
Thank you, Lori.
No, not really. Me, just, yeah, wanted to be antagonistic. I wanted to make sure that whatever system allows us to, you know, compensate people appropriately based on their education experience and stuff like that. If the more senior person deserves that higher wage, we have that flexibility. But as somebody who has held positions where I felt I was more knowledgeable or valuable maybe to the company than more senior people, you know, if somebody is more junior but deserves a higher wage, I wonder if we have that flexibility as well. Just because you've had a job for a long time does not mean you're the best at it. So
that is the other side of it as
Sure.
well. Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, the answer is yes.
Okay.
This does provide that flexibility.
Okay.
I would say yes.
Councilwoman Ingebretson.
So, I know that the Casper PD's been separated out, but what about the fire department? How are they assessed?
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, given their union agreement, that drives a lot of how those decisions are made. And so this implementation would not include the fire department.
Okay.
Okay. We have nothing else to do.
Unless there's other questions.
Any other questions? Okay,
Thanks, Lori.
thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, we'll move on to budget review. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So as far as the second half of the meeting is concerned tonight, we tried to take a number of the questions that you had in our first meeting, Monday night, as well as the homework assignments that you gave us, to put together an assembly of information to hopefully capture answers and maybe provide solutions with regard to some of the concerns that you have or directions that you may want to provide. And so we have a much smaller graphical presentation we want to share with you tonight to try to get at the heart of some of your questions, as well as follow up with, like I said, homework assignments that you gave us from Monday night. And all of this is meant to generate dialogue and questions, and you should feel comfortable, as far as I'm concerned, engaging in either of those. And so, Mr. Mayor, if I could, I'll probably come back up here and walk through the presentation with you, and then try to answer other questions that we have available via some handouts tonight that, again, kind of responds directly to some of the homework that you gave us. If we've missed anything, however, and haven't covered, I would absolutely hope that you'll, get us engaged on those questions as well, and we'll do our best to try to answer everything you have tonight, if we can. So, can we take that or?
We're hoping to get closer in order.
Well, it did work pretty good last time, so. Okay, I may just need you to walk us through, not just to All right, so one of the biggest questions that, of course, we wanted to be sure we understood really, really well was with regard to the comparative position of each of our, budgets that we've presented you in recent years and how it compares to this year. So there's two dynamics, though, that I'd like you to be aware of in trying to answer that question. One of the numbers that was given was that there might be a $13 to $15 million disparity and so on. So if we could get us to the first slide here. the challenge that we have is when we need to compare apples to apples, because the reality is the very first budget we present to you has a propensity to change throughout the fiscal year, particularly if you're going to be rolling capital projects that weren't concluded in a previous year to the new year. Makes it look like it's actually a much bigger budget when the reality is you're just moving the cost of a project into another year in order to get it completed, right? There is also the dynamic, like was the case in 2018, where the budget that was presented to you in 2018 actually called for a reserve balancing factor that impacted the reserve by some 25%. And so when I came on board, which was right at the very beginning of this budget year, very beginning of this budget year, council said, we don't like that reserve requirement, therefore we'd like you to adjust that budget and bring us a new one. So what you see here will be quite a bit different in the slide next, because by virtue of the amendment that we brought forward, I think in October or something like that, this number came way down, okay? That's just one real life example of why the distinction between what's originally proposed to what actually occurs is important to understand. You'll see a real similar dynamic in 21. 21 was a budget that we purposefully, jacked downwards. We were worried about revenue. We were worried about curtailing expenses. And this actually represents a dependency on reserves of somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.8 million. And that's not new to you. We talked about that on Monday night as being kind of a unique feature of fiscal year 21. So as we go to the actual sort of scenario, you start to see those things come into more focus. For example, once we passed that first amendment in 18, that budget went from here to here and relied on 0 reserve dollars to make happen, okay? In 21, particularly as you look in the next slide, things occurred that we didn't expect would occur. So if you'll hit the next slide, that made this budget look as though it was a much bigger budget than what it really truly was. Because we did roll in some capital from the previous year in order to finish those projects, if you will, in this fiscal year. We also got an infusion of federal dollars that made that expense line jump up, even though it was not what it is that we proposed to begin with, okay? Going backwards again, Evan, if I could. Remember, okay, well that's all right, we'll just leave it here. No problem. This is, there we go. This is where we were, right, when we came to you. And when you look at it historically speaking, and particularly if we had a longer history to show you, this would be a historically low budget. However, when July 1 rolls around, what you're actually going to see is a budget that's more like this. Okay? Now, when you're comparing, actuals to what it is that we're actually proposing, this budget, fiscal year 22, is technically $700,000 shorter than this budget, meaning we're going to require less funding to complete this year's budget compared to this budget. And so the reality often, tells a different story. When those numbers are compared on an actual basis, when those numbers are compared to an original basis, you have to watch what it is that you're reflecting upon in order to actually see what it is that you're understanding about the proposals that are being brought forward. So,
Quick question.
Councilman Casper.
please.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So basically as well, what you're saying is that 22, if we were able to complete all of the projects, the capital projects in FY 22, there is a good possibility that that budget for 22 will rise because of carryovers from 21.
There's a very distinct possibility, Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that this is going to look different this time next year
Because of the carryovers.
because of carryovers.
And
Yep.
depending on these carryovers versus carryovers next year, that could actually wind up being less because of projects completed as
Being
well.
completed, that's
Or
exactly
not
right.
completed.
Right, yep. Those dynamics can influence how things end up. That's exactly right. The other side of the coin is that I want you to understand when folks look into these numbers from the outside looking in, if you will, and they see disparities between budgets and so on. The quickest assumption that I deal with every single time is that the features that are driving the heights of these budgets on charts like this are pay raises and people getting all kinds of, that the increased costs are dedicated to people and so on. And what I'm here to present to you and let you know is 9 times out of 10, that fluctuation is far more attributable to the degree of capital that the budget takes on from year to year. Far more guilty piece of the puzzle than it is people. And you'll see why here in a minute with another graphic I want to show to you. Very consistent with what we talked about last time. When you're talking about an original budget in FY21 of 16 million, 16.5 being dedicated to capital, and we're talking to you now for FY22 of a capital agenda in the neighborhood of 28, 29 million, that distinction is clear. For folks that, again, kind of look in and don't understand those details, they typically want to jump right to the conclusion that somehow operational expenses are way out of whack and getting out of control and everything else. Okay, any other questions about this series of data? Okay, if we could move on then, let's talk about positions. The history of the organization is such that, as you can see, we generally hover around somewhere between 500 and 600 full-time positions. If you were to add the impacts that part-time positions bring to this, you would want to add on top of these bars somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 200 people, depending on the season, depending on the services we're trying to provide, depending on our ability to pay, and so on. But generally speaking, 150 is what you would add, okay, on each of these bars. We're dealing with full-time positions here. As I mentioned last time, we are dealing with the results of a couple concurrent financial cataclysms, if you will, within the last 5 years that have driven the amount of full-time positions that we have utilized in a downward fashion, okay? To the point that for fiscal year 21, when you include your positions, which I know some of you would say, we're employees, really? We are at the level of 498 active FTE, okay? But again, including all 9 of you as well. The proposition that we're bringing forward, when you take, transit off the table, says we would be at this level if you approve everything that we have asked you to approve for the new year, okay? So that would be a growth of 498 to 505, all right? Now, the other thing that I would have you remember too is that with respect to those positions, this is representative of all of the positions that we're requesting from you across the organization. So this is not just a general fund impact, okay? This includes, solid waste, it includes the shares that utilities take on for some of the positions that come in and so on. We have given you a memo tonight that breaks this request down much, much further than what it was we chatted about on Monday night, okay? And so with that, I'd like to share with you some of those dynamics. I represented to you that in all of the positions that we are asking for, you are really only seeing a true blue growth of government, if you will, true blue growth of government with positions we have never had in this organization before of what I would say is 5.5. Okay? 5.5. And to remind you, those positions are the communications and marketing person for the utilities. Okay, that would be one of these. The cybersecurity analyst, which is also shared with the utilities, even though the number in there would not suggest that. A fire captain for training, and that is exclusive to the general fund. A digital records specialist in the PD, brand spanking new position, all accounted for entirely by the general fund. A part-time position, that's where that half comes from, in Metro, which I think we can share among our participating agencies as well in terms of that cost. And an equipment operator in the bale fill, which I think is dedicated to the recycling effort. Is that true? Or as a result of that? But that's exclusively borne by the bale fill and the recycling costs and so on. So a decision to not fund any of these requests is a decision to not fund 5.5 positions that are brand spanking new, okay? But it's also a decision to not fund a number of positions that are only really requiring a smaller amount of dollars because of the fact that it's being funded with other positions that we've had or upgrading or whatever. One very clean example of that is with regard to the clerk of court. That position that we're currently trying to fill is a position that you have requested and is being funded in large part by the analyst position that's currently in the municipal court. And so for you to tell us we're not going to fund any new positions would include that. Okay? It would include that. Obviously, you can give us any variation of direction, right, with regard to any of this, of course. The city engineer position, a suggestion on your part of funding 0 new positions would include not funding Andrew's city engineer position, which is a position that has had a very, very long history in this organization. And only recently not been funded, due in large part to ways in trying to find a means of dealing with the pressures that the absence of revenue is manifested here. So I would say that's a clear example of a recovery type position that we believe we just simply need. But that is also a position, if you'll remember correctly, that would be funded in large part by an internal applicant that would be successful in getting that job, because that position that would be left would not be backfilled. I would argue that if development increases in this community, you're going to need that backfill position, but for right now, we're suggesting that that improvement in Andrew's department would be funded in part by that position that would not be backfilled. A recommendation to fund 0 positions would also include that one. That is really only an impact of $17,000 in total. So, I am very clearly suggesting that that I am asking for some variation with regard to a decision for the positions that we are asking for your support for, okay? I recognize that you may not be comfortable with a climb from 498 to 505 across the organization. That may be too much, I understand, okay? But I would also say that some of this is representative by trying to be in keeping with your direction. Some of this is representative by trying to keep up with the tides of the times, particularly as we're talking about our digital specialist in PD, our cybersecurity person in IT, okay? Some of this is without a doubt trying to recover from the beating the employee count has taken throughout the last several years in order to keep up with the services that your citizens are demanding right now. I am telling you that by improving from 498 to 505, we are attempting to keep up with the services we already provide and do it in a manner that is consistent with what the citizens expect right now, not in the form of adding programs or adding services or whatever. We're just trying to keep up with what we have been doing for years and years and years, and in the last several years have not filled in order to reconcile with the revenue issues of the day. Okay? So, yes, I'm not really trying to waver on what it is that I need for the organization, but I am trying to give you room, if you will, to decide to fund in part. I hope you'll fund in full, but I certainly hope you'll avoid a recommendation of funding absolutely nothing, because I don't think that would be consistent with what you expect out of us in terms of dealing with a lot of the things we're trying to deal with.
Carter, one thing I just want to point out, correct me if I'm wrong, but since 16, I mean, we've been on this steady decline in the amount of employees. In fiscal year 2020, you had an increase that took place, but that's in large part due to the fact that we increased the SROs within the school. Right. And then fiscal year 21, now we've lost 4 or 3, I guess, number-wise, 3 SROs this year, so that number actually decreased off of the increase we had in 20, correct?
Right. Yep, absolutely.
All right. Councilman Hill.
On that same line of thinking, weren't those 3 people we still retain? They may not be SROs, but they're still on our payroll. So it wouldn't decrease that number. They're still working for us, correct?
Mr. Mayor, the fact is, PD, as a result of the relationship with the school district, was advanced to a full sworn strength of 109 officers. With respect to the changes in the school district and their ADM and the amount of funding that they're going to get and so on, they are funding less SROs. And because we were not at a level of 109 actually boots on the ground, we are suggesting that because we don't have to lay off anybody, we're reducing that sworn level down to 106 to be in keeping with the revenue that's available to maintain the SRO program. And so your full sworn team is being reduced if this budget is passed like it's being proposed.
So my actual question was, looking at your chart, we're only going to gain 7 people, but our budget's going to grow by almost $1 million over 7 people. So explain that to me, unless each person's making serious bank, because the numbers don't jive.
So the totals on the form that I'm looking at, and the memo that we're putting together, and you have every single one of those costs broken out, is $659,000 in the general fund and $285,000 in the enterprises. Okay, and that's non-transit. That's not, transit is not a figure of this calculation. Okay, those are your numbers. The footprint that each position requires is broken out in strict detail with regard to each of those broad fund impacts. Okay, so for example, for the police digital record specialist, That position will require $93,000, as you see in the top of your chart there.
Got it.
Yep. For the administrative assistant in Metro, that clerical part-time position, that's gonna require $26,000. If you follow each of those entries, that gets you to the exact number that we're looking for in the budget. And it is included in the budget, which does not mean that you do not have the ability to pull it out and fund what you want to fund. That's absolutely the case. You have that flexibility and authority.
Councilman Cast?
In reality, though, you're asking for that 7 increase, but by the same token, we are actually increasing by another 24 because of bringing transit in as well, aren't we? So in essence, we are going from 498 to 529.
Mr. Mayor,
Or
when you
were
add
we
those-
already paying that before?
you just exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
We were already paying
I
for
say
that.
yes.
Okay.
That's why I kind of took that off the table in terms of the real difference, because the real difference is from here to here. You've always been paying for that. It's just been through a private operator.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in essence, you could add that 24 onto all of those numbers across the board then.
I think that's a fair statement. Yeah. Even though the numbers would vary. Yeah. By few.
So now how do we get to the million that he was talking about?
I would say this is what you need to refer to for the actual math. This is what you need to refer to for the actual math.
Which is what I'm doing.
Yep.
And according to that chart, we're gaining 7 positions. According to this piece of paper, our budget is being increased over $1 million. And I understand the way you've broken it down, but the numbers are what they are. We're gaining 7 employees, but our budget's increasing by over $1 million.
I have nothing to say in terms of trying to argue what this math tells you, okay? This is the math. This is absolutely the math.
So the
So you're
25 is
adding
coming
this
from
650
other
into the
departments.
Those are part of the positions, yeah.
This is not paid for out of the general fund.
Councilwoman
I'm
Ingrid,
sorry.
please.
The 285 is coming from out of this $1 million, so the 285 is actually being from other departments, so it's not coming from necessarily our general fund, correct?
The 285, Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, is what the utilities would contribute to the footprint that Mr. Nell is describing.
Okay.
Okay, that financial footprint. So, but I would also say, even though we didn't add it into this particular demonstration, that cybersecurity person would also be shared with utilities as well. Doesn't change the overall math, right? But it is a shared position also, okay, in terms of its cost.
I'm gonna say 3 things real quick. It's wage and benefits, not just
Fully loaded.
wage.
Fully loaded.
Yep, so it's fully, so there's a lot more that goes into that $1 million. It's not $1 million, it's 944,272. And Councilmember Paul.
I had 3 things.
I did.
One of
You
them
were
was-
the third
oh,
thing,
okay.
so.
I got it, okay. I have a clarifying question and then just a statement, but Carter, in the far right column, does that represent the net change to the cost of that position to the general fund? I'm thinking specifically about the repurposed and reclassified positions. Is that the overall change in the expense of that position compared to wherever that person may be being repurposed from?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why the city engineer it looks like a bargain at $17,000, right?
I just
Yeah.
thought we were getting like a, high school student or something to.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
And then the statement, I just to kind of, for me, I'm just trying to put this into perspective of the overall budget and of the value of these positions. So I'm thinking specifically like the police digital record specialist and the information security analyst, like that's like one lawsuit or one security breach away from $650,000 expense to the city. So I feel like, so many of these things are just preventing expense, potential expense and liability for the city in the future. Like, to me, it seems like like a bargain when you look at it compared to just one single lawsuit from not being able to process, you know, public record body cam footage. So.
Councilwoman Lutz?
So, from the accounting's perspective, overgeneralization in accounting is extremely dangerous. And the reason I say that is there's actually 20 positions here. Sure, we are adding 7 new positions. We are talking about 20 positions. So to generalize it to adding 7 is inaccurate. There's 20 positions that change. Some of which obviously even have like a negative impact on the city manager's analyst position. It's actually a negative $17,000 when you total it out. And so it's 20 positions that boil down to it, and we also offer generous benefits. This isn't money that's like, directly going like into their pockets necessarily. It's also in the form of health insurance and vision and dental. And so that's a huge chunk of that million. I'm sure if we calculated out the difference. Also with the cybersecurity thing, I'm sure you guys follow the news. Colonial Pipeline had to pay $4.4 million due to a cybersecurity attack to get control back of their system, which provides, I think it's like 34% of energy to the eastern coastline. So the cybersecurity thing is not a joke. I mean, it could cost multiples of this entire packet due to that one position keeping us protected from something like that.
Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Yeah, the only thing I'm not going to continue on because I agree both with what you two said. I think this is, it's again, I keep going back, it's reasonable, it's prudent approach to adding positions. I think there are things that you know you need for the city. And if you came up to us and said, look, this is a bunch of fat, I'm not sure, I'm concerned about it. I think you understand what the city needs. And I think just exactly what Amber had said, I think that it does in the long run is going to help us financially in the long run. And so you've been without an assistant city manager too since you started. And so generally municipalities of this size have some type of an assistant city manager, and you've been running without one for, well, 4 or 5 years now. So, you know, it's good, and it's, I understand where you're coming from with this, and it's exactly what Kristen said, so I'm supportive of it.
Councilman Gamros.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I have a hard time critiquing any of the proposed positions, and I trust that you all know what you need in your departments, and you know, I don't have any issues with this necessarily, but I am just always a curious fella. It looks like about a 12% reduction in positions from 2016 to last year, 2021. And so I'm curious, did we identify efficiencies? I understand that was, you know, kind of outside our control, didn't have the money we used to and stuff like that, but cutting those 12% of positions, I wonder if we had a bunch of money now, would we fill all those positions again, or have we identified efficiencies? Has public sentiment changed significantly from 2016 to 2021? I'm just curious, you know, what impact that had.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Gamroth, I would suggest that the information you have here is representative of that very concept. We are impacting 20 positions, and the reality is we're trying to take minimal expense to upgrade certain positions in order to get what we need to make up for the deficiencies that a situation like this can create when you're trying to provide services. Because as you all know, when you're providing services, when you're a service providing organization, it takes people primarily to do that. And so the reason I like this proposal is because it is a minimal increase in terms of the footprint overall. It utilizes positions that we have currently in place that with tweaks, we can get what we need for now, right? And we're not asking for, you know, a jump from here to here overnight, which I would be uncomfortable with. Because one, I don't think we could afford it, and two, it would require a lot of betting on the come. And I don't think this does that.
Councilman now.
Thank you, Mayor. So, I'm not necessarily opposed to this. Where my issue comes in, I understand cybersecurity. My wife's law office just got nailed. They want 2 Bitcoin to give her files back. Thank God she's got 4 cases left, and she's old school and has the hard copies, and she said, keep my files, do what you want. You know, so we were able to escape that. So we got lucky. But there's another law office in town that got hit, and they paid the 2 Bitcoin, $100 and some thousand, and didn't get their stuff back. So I understand cybersecurity, I understand the need for it. My only issue is I'm trying to hold myself accountable when it comes to growing government in a downturn. Government in its own right is too damn big, in my opinion, and anytime we want to make it bigger, and we want to do that during a financial hardship time, is really, really hard for me to tie into. I know we need some of these positions. I know that I mean, I get it. I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate here and say, you know, I ran to get this position on being fiscally responsible and on downsizing our government, not growing it, and here we are adding positions, adding, you know, 900 and however many $1,000s to the budget to do that. And so that's tough for me, and that's where I'm coming from. I hope you understand that, Carter. I want you and your department heads to understand that I know that you need help, and I know the work you put into what you do. I know how many hours, poor Liz, I don't know if she even gets to eat dinner. I know the hours she's putting in. I get it. And it's probably no different for anybody else. But we also have to somebody's got to throw some questions in the air sometimes, and we got to,
Sure.
You know what I mean? So please don't think I'm being disrespectful to you or to your needs or to the amount of work that you've put in. I'm just trying to be responsible here, and it's just really, it's a tough juggling thing to deal with. So,
Councilwoman Ingrid.
So, like, this is just more of a statement. I guess part of it is the specialist that we're all talking about for the cyber attacks. It's here. It's in every industry. We've got it happening in real estate, law, you name it, it's everywhere. I'm amazed that we don't have a person already staffed doing this. And in my mind, I guess I consider this more of your deferred maintenance or maintenance, because this is a CYA. We should have had this in place a long time ago. And the fact that something hasn't happened is amazing to me. And I just think it's not, if it's going to happen, I think it's just a win.
I'm going to make a comment off of that too, is that, you know, we look at reinforcing this building for what reason, but to protect our employees. We paid law enforcement officers 4 years. We have paid for training for school shootings. Why? Because it could happen. Did it happen? Yes, Casper College happened. During this last year, during the pandemic, we brought in extra people because we had issues on a Wednesday during a peaceful protest to make sure it didn't happen on Friday. Sometimes we just have to spend money in order to protect the people. In looking at the same position that we're talking about, this is money well spent, in my opinion. Because if we don't protect what we have here, and we have a lot of information on all the citizens within this community, and it takes getting hacked one time to do exactly what you said. Is the cost today going to outweigh the lawsuit tomorrow, or what we lose tomorrow? No. So, to me, you're in government. You're going to have to spend money. Simple as that. We can't just sit there and say, well, it's $1 million or it's $944,272. Can't spend it because we don't want to increase. Sometimes we got to spend money. And in these situations, I think it needs to be done. We've continually decreased over the years the amount of employees we have. It's time to get back where we need to be. And if we got to spend money to do that, in my opinion, we need to do that. It's preventative. It's not necessary. This has nothing. It has to do with budgetary and money and what we can afford. But at the end of the day, there are some things you're going to have to fund. So being fiscally responsible, I'm really kind of getting tired of hearing that term. We all know why we're here, and we know why we're doing what we do. But at the end of the day, you got to do what's right. Simple as that. Councilmember Paul.
So I would just say, I propose that we fund all of these, and I would just ask if there's a counter proposal with a specific, something specific that we'd like to see out of here. Otherwise, I think we have the information we need to make the the next step here.
Councilman Gamrot, did you have something?
I did, but if that's a proposal, I'm fine. My question's unrelated, so if we'd like to wrap this up, and I don't know how, if you still got presentation slides to get through, I have a comment that I'd like to make at some point.
Okay, Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you have a few more slides to go over them, and I do want to make sure that give you the opportunity to continue to do that. But I think ultimately we can look at that, and I think if there's a specific proposal that can be made forward of eliminating positions or whatever, I'm all in favor of moving forward with all of them. But if you have more things to go over, I'd be willing to look at those two cards.
I do indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Moving on then, one of the questions was with regard to how workers' comp is doing, because indeed you have seen some impacts there. We certainly are at the position now of being hampered by our history relating, in part at least, to this year. And so yes, you certainly are seeing some cost increases. I would think that next year we should be able to shed this history, right? And have a better cycle, hopefully. Maybe this line flattening, assuming we don't have horrible history that pushes this line up or whatever. But my hope is that by getting rid of bad cycles, and as you can see, we've had a number of them in the past, things should start to flatten or hopefully even improve. It wasn't a huge discussion last time, but we did want to bring forward this data so you could see what exactly is going on with workers' comp. We had some conversation about 1 cent last time too, and I want to bring this forward. It simply is a matter of providing you some information. You can see here that with the current obligations that we have to these agencies, we are going to spend in the neighborhood of $1.3 million out of the current year for the current cycle of 1 cent 16. And as you can see here, it's kind of broken out this way. Now, one thing that I did not mention to all of you the last time we spoke, and frankly it just dawned on me yesterday, is that indeed you will be the council that negotiates the new resolution with the public as to how the new cycle is allocated, if, of course, it passes, right? So 1 cent 17 will be the course you get to set as it relates to that resolution and that contract with the community, if you will. So I bring this to your attention, not because you have any wiggle room to really, renegotiate all these contracts and all that kind of thing, but rather to plant the bug in your ear early that if in fact you would like to see something different than what we've got here, you're actually going to have the opportunity to drive that discussion. And accordingly, as it relates to how those dollars are allocated across capital requirements, that'll be your car to drive as well. Because indeed, if you feel like streets are underfunded in 1 cent or whatever, you get the opportunity to make that change for 1 cent 17 if you so choose. So in other words, you'll be setting the table for the next 4 years during your tenure, if we're fortunate enough to see 1 cent pass again for cycle 17. So again, really for your purposes to see how it all lays out, but also to plant the bug in your ear early that you're going to be in the driver's seat to make a lot of these decisions next time. Okay? In that regard then, let's move to the next.
Councilman Casper.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Back it
on
up. Yep.
Yes. Is that 1.07, is that with the 20% reduction for this year that we asked them to take?
No. The 1.07 would be, in my estimation, the capital that's coming out of this as well for other agencies. Does that sound right, Evan and Pete?
Yeah.
Yes, we had them do a 20% reduction last year, but that is not a 20% reduction.
That does not impact these numbers here. So that was a FY21 impact only
Okay, so this is the full funding then to those.
for 22.
Okay.
Okay. Appreciate that question. So this brings me right into what I feel like there's a lot of conversation about last time, and that is with respect to capital. Capital really does drive a lot of what you do. And oftentimes is the culprit for budgets looking substantially different. Without a doubt, there's a lot of variables that can make budgets look substantially different, but 9 times out of 10, it's this right here. As you can see here, this is what you're dedicating to capital-based uses in 1 cent for 22. And to be even abundantly clear, more clear, this is money you already have on hand. Because remember, you made the decision last year to put off any projections at all and rather wait until you collect money to determine how to spend it based on what you actually gather. Okay? So this is 100% cash on hand. Okay? From the utility side of things, water, sewer, sanitation, you're going to spend, almost $7 million doing projects there. Okay? And again, that's cash that you have. The distinction, however, that I want to be clear about is when it comes to grants coming through, if those grants do not come through, we are not proposing that those projects move forward. Okay? So if we are unsuccessful in getting dollars and cents through those channels, you will not see a recommendation come forward to us from us to award those contracts for construction. Okay? And then yes, in much smaller influences, you're seeing some dollars being spent from other reserves. This right here is what is money that will be coming into perpetual care via contract with the Housing Authority, and I think Regional Water feeds into this too, is that right? Yeah. And the Opportunity Fund, this is the project to redo the Senior Center parking lot. We talked about this in the capital agenda meetings of a few months ago. That is the only piece of funding that we're recommending at this point from the Opportunity Fund. Okay, which is different than years past. Goodstein, for example, is probably the biggest expense from the Opportunity Fund that I remember. That's about $1 million, and that work's going on right now. Not an FY22 issue. Okay. One of the things that I wanted to be clear on, and I'm being purposefully emphatic, is the idea that these are all cash-based proposals. Okay. So if indeed you did want to lower the budget, a lot of times you can get a lot of bang for your buck by not doing projects to lower that budget. Certainly, when it comes to people, furloughs was one way that we used last year in order to contain our expenses. I'm not recommending anything like that this year, thank heavens. Okay? But if indeed you did want to lower the budget, oftentimes this is where you get a lot of bang for your buck. The challenge that you all have is that if you do want to lower this capital agenda, you're simply pooling cash that you already have. You're not really reducing a prospect for revenue that may or may not come in. You're simply saying, we're going to take the cash that we already have for project A and B or whatever, and we're going to set it aside and not do that project. You then essentially are creating a savings account. You're not saving expenses for money that might not come. And that is dramatically different than the way this organization has operated for the last several decades. This is a brand new component of your budget strategy that you now have the luxury of doing because you took that tough move last year and now you've got cash you can work with. So part of that equation that you need to consider is, okay, if we do decide to not do projects, what do you want to do with that money that you're simply just pushing aside and holding for another time or another function? Okay?
Councilman Kesman.
In essence, if we take money out of there, we're putting it in the bank at 1% interest and, or less. And turning, it just makes it easy. We're putting it in the bank at 1% and losing 2% because of inflation if we turn around and do it next year. So we're net 2% loss on, in theory, what we could get as far as bang for our buck.
That could be a pretty fair assessment, Mr. Mayor. Now, the only distinction I would create for you in that scenario is, if for whatever reason you want to pull, money from here and appropriate to a different project because you want to prioritize a different project better or higher or whatever, then that would be another distinction that council obviously has the authority to make happen. And that may be the case for streets, for example. And I'll show you a couple ways in which you can do that.
Councilmember Clark.
In my mind, it's, unless we do have a different project that we think those funds should be used for, I think it's inappropriate for us to pool taxpayer dollars that were specifically voted on to allow us to do these sorts of things, because if that's the case, really the citizens should just have that money in their pocket generating interest for them versus generating interest for us. So I think it's inappropriate for us to move forward with that strategy unless we do truly have a bigger project or something like that we're wanting to reserve those dollars for and combine them with this coming year's 1 cent dollars or something like that. I personally am happy with the projects that we have slated, but I think the discussion should not be let's pool them somewhere. I don't really feel like we're at liberty to do that without some sort of specific plan for it.
Pursuant to, Mr. Mayor, if I may, the topic that seemed to dominate a lot of conversation last time, and that was with regard to funding streets more appropriately or whatever, right? We did discuss very briefly the idea that if you wanted to de-subsidize the capital programs associated with water and sewer, that would free up money real quickly that could be made available for street projects. I want to show you what that looks like, and I invited Andrew to put together a prospectus as to how, in fact, he would use a doubling of the money he has available to himself now, almost a doubling anyway, to put that to work in the streets category, if you so choose. Before I turn that to him, Mr. Mayor, however, I'd like you to see what that looks like in water and sewer, okay? And so this is the water fund. Again, this is like, I don't know, maybe the 6th time you've seen this pro forma, right? If in fact we take out that 1 cent subsidy and continue with the same capital agenda, in other words, we don't adjust those expenses because of the loss of that subsidy, this is what happens to your curve. Oh, it does change, I promise.
Wow.
That's
Sorry, we have to go to the live version of this.
Now remember, that is if we do nothing to adjust for the expenses that 1% money was going to support, okay? Obviously, if we take out that subsidy, we gotta do something so that we're not going broke in 2 years, right? Because that expense is continued without any abatement. We would never recommend that. The other thing though, is that if you do wanna keep up with that same capital agenda in here, in the absence of those 1 cent monies being there, You gotta do something with rates, or you gotta find grants that will support those projects. 9 times out of 10, finding grants to support those projects is a heavier lift. And generally that means you want to reduce your capital agenda in order for that curve to respond more appropriately to the loss of those dollars. Some, you know, you may want to consider what it would take to deal with that from a rate perspective. And Evan has kind of given us some ideas here. If you wanted to obviously get that curve
That would go over well.
to react much more quickly, you're going to front load those rate increases, right? If you're comfortable with that blue curve kind of taking its time to get, you know, in that ideal operating condition, then you're going to not be so worried about front loading those rates. And you'll smooth those rates over time so that that blue curve gets back on a more gradual basis.
Councilmember Paul.
And when you say, you know, we would need to, so I'm seeing, you know, an enormous rate increase here, which I think nobody in their right mind would propose. You're saying the other option would be to adjust our capital agenda, and would you categorize that if we needed to adjust our capital agenda, would you categorize that as deferred maintenance?
Mr. Mayor, I would categorize it as just not doing as much.
In terms of maintaining our water system.
Because the other thing you're going to be dealing with in this fund, as the regional board representatives will tell you here, in fact the mayor kind of gave us that heads up last night, you also have the increasing cost of the water we buy from regional water. And typically, it sure seems like it anyway, that's like a 5% increase every year. I don't know that it has to be, but that's what it ends up being, you know. Of course, I don't know because I don't attend those meetings. But
It's actually 5%.
Yeah, it's 5%.
yeah, it seems like that's their standard. I don't know, Andrew, what the deal is, but anyway, you have that to contend with as well. So without an adjustment in terms of what you do from an expense standpoint, that's going to exacerbate the issues with your blue curve as well, because that seems like it has to go up every single year, and that's a big purchase. Water fund, buying water.
One
So-
just clarifying question, I guess, since you mentioned the 5%. So we increase our rate that we pay, that taxpayers, that's 2%, but we as a city get charged 5% additionally annually from regional water. Are we paying a disproportionate amount of water? You know, are we paying more for water than residents essentially year over year?
I appreciate that question, and as the regional board members of your colleagues would say, we are Regional Water's biggest customer. We buy the most water from them than anybody else on the regional system. And so from a disproportionate standpoint, I would say no, you know, because we only buy what we need. Now, in terms of what the citizens pay in comparison to the rest of the customers throughout the system, we not only account for what we pay to regional water, we also account for what it is that we pay to maintain our distribution system. I would tell you that our rates are very, very competitive and are made more competitive, perhaps artificially so, because we do inject 1 cent money into the portfolio that this fund enjoys in order to keep our citizen rates lower.
Further clarification, are we injecting more and more subsidy year over year to keep those rates low, or is it kind of a static, same amount every year?
It's a static same amount every year. 2.5 million, I think, Andrew, since the program has been in place.
Mayor, it was drastically reduced last year when all of 1 cent funding was curtailed. That went from 2.5 down to 1.2 or in that percentage.
So typically 2.5 is what you can expect.
Thank you.
Councilman Kelsey.
If I understand correctly, the money that we infuse into that fund from 1 cent is to actually replace the old broken lines as opposed to subsidizing the purchasing of water from regional water. Is that so that basically we're replacing lines with the 1 cent money rather than raising rates to pay for the replacement of lines?
But the revenue generated from the rates that would typically go to maybe replacing lines, are we doing it in exchange from that, or? Sorry, the budget, so, the revenue generated from ratepayers, is there money that would typically go towards those capital projects, replacing them in pipelines, that is instead going on their end to subsidize for taxpayers, and we are simply stepping in and providing that subsidy to do that capital that would otherwise be covered by the rates? Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yeah,
So if
yeah,
the 1 cent
basically
goes
we're
away,
using,
how do you pay to replace the lines?
you raise rates.
you raise rates.
Significant.
Or you try to find other sources.
And that's,
Sometimes
and
it's
in
grants,
essence, that's what
sometimes-
this graph is saying,
Yeah.
is that if you don't put in the 1% money, then you would have to start raising rates 16% a year to cover the money that
Annually.
the water fund needs for ratepayers plus the distribution system and the replacement of the bad lines.
If you're not willing to reduce your capital agenda, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But then you'll end up with Flint.
Further clarification. I've almost got it, I think, but we're saying
Further
that-
than me.
Well, I don't know. It's a carry on from yours. So if our cost for water is increasing by about 5% a year, we are not increasing our rates to citizens by 5% a year. So what money is subsidizing that difference?
That's where I'm trying to go. That's
So
what's
if
not
one
making sense.
if 1 cent funds are going to capital projects, where's that 5% coming from?
In order to support the cost in water.
Yes.
Correct.
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember, the beauty of this particular fund and its corresponding health is you've been able to absorb a lot of those kind of operational costs with the fund equity that you have in this fund.
Okay.
And that's been done on purpose for, a bunch of reasons, policy decisions made for years now, probably to keep up with capital, probably to keep up with other costs that are unanticipated. But the reality is, operationally speaking, you're getting some of that absorption with this behavior right here from the fund equity of the fund.
Okay.
Okay?
So-
Please, yes, ma'am.
The only thing I was going to say is, though, I think what Carter's almost insinuating is at some point, though, we are going to have to compensate for the difference with a larger rate increase because there's only so much fund equity that we can burn through for so long. And obviously, that's very clear by the declining line. So that's fine for now. It's not going to be fine forever.
Unless you manipulate the capital agenda.
Correct. Yes.
To get that blue line to ride,
Or if we were to
yourself.
lose 1 cent.
Yeah,
Ugh.
positively, yes.
That's-
If we lose at 1 cent, you're back to the 16 rate increases.
So,
Councilman Gamble.
thank you, Mayor. So yeah, Amber probably put it more articulately than me, as she often does, but that's what I'm wondering is, this reminds me of the talks we had with Tim about rate increases at the aquatic center. It makes me feel like there was probably years where the city should have been charging higher rates, but we were absorbing that to keep it lower for the residents. I wonder if this is one of many cases of us doing that, and at some point, I'm a taxpayer, so I can speak for myself, but I personally want to reconcile that. I want to pay what I believe is a fair rate and not have the city subsidize all of my rates for me, essentially, because we're not in a position to do that, I don't think. So I guess that was my question. Is it similar to, like something like the aquatic center where we were subsidizing rates, not keeping them up to fair market, and we find ourselves just, line slowly going down, and so.
And Mr. Mayor, Councilman, your comparison is actually right on because aquatics does take a 1 cent subsidy in order to keep rates at the gates of the pool, pretty low.
Councilman Nell.
Well, and on that same line, getting a raise for our water system, I don't know if you remember how much hell we caught for the aquatics, but we only went up 50 cents. And we got bombarded. I mean, we're talking 50 cents. So when you're asking for an increase, which if we were to lose 1 cent would be around 15%. I wonder, I guess I'm just piggybacking off you. I wonder if now isn't the time to maybe ask for a slight rate increase and start building that fund, because we've got anticipatory things to worry about, like 1 cent maybe not coming back and things like that. And I wonder if it wouldn't behoove us to get ahead of that now. I'm just asking.
Yeah. Mr. Mayor, these are exactly the policy debates that are needed for decisions like this, because, you know, the decision I'm kind of pushing you for is whether or not you want to use those dollars for streets and take it out of water, right? And that's only because it's kind of a follow-up to the discussion we had Monday night. But the reality is, in November, you're going to be diving into this really, really deeply when you consider whether or not a 2% increase is appropriate now compared to 15 later on down the road when, you know, if 1% goes away, either by policy or by vote, right?
Councilmember Pollock?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we don't have to consider rate increase specifically tonight.
Right.
But I do think it is worth, I think we're kind of alluding to the same thing where, we may be in a position where we need some of these 1 cent dollars when that time comes for other projects, and we may not be able to continue to absorb rate increases that we're experiencing on a general level if we do in fact want to see our streets, for instance, maintained at the current level that we have, which I do want to see our streets maintained or improved. And so we may need to look at reallocating those things, but neither of those decisions are ours to make in this current budget. Is that correct? We're not discussing rate increases or 1 cent allocations for the current budget discussion. Is that?
Mr. Mayor, council member, you're boiling it down right to the heart of
Trying
where,
to.
Yeah, you are, and,
Okay.
and I appreciate that, because if indeed you do want to dedicate more money to the streets program as a function of the fiscal year 22 budget, those decisions would be helpful to have now. And this is only one way of doing that. It's just simply one shot at it. The reality is you've got a lot of longer term options in the form of restructuring 1 cent 17, in the form of looking at direct distribution more critically in its role in the general fund operations, right? There's a lot of ways you can skin the cat, if you will, of getting more money to, oh, I'm sorry, skin the skunk.
Cat lady, right?
In the form of getting more dollars to Andrew and the streets projects. This is only one way.
So follow up to that then, if we did say tonight, we do want to see more money going to the streets, we would theoretically be committing ourselves to a rate increase discussion if we took it from here when that comes up. Is that?
Mr. Mayor, council member, unless you were willing to deal with the capital agenda and manipulate the capital agenda so that this curve doesn't drop off the planet immediately.
Yeah.
Right? And you have that option as well.
So, so I guess the question is, what direction do you need tonight for this budget? Are you asking us, like, do we want to spend more money on streets? And if so, do we want to address it through water, or as opposed to the budget that you've presented us now, if we're looking for a street budget increase?
I have a question to piggyback before he answers that, if that's okay.
Okay.
Because we're proposing an additional 1% tax. And so in November, to just go for special projects and things of that nature. Is some of the street projects something that could be also
Just Midwest.
just Midwest?
Yeah.
But I mean, everybody is complaining about all the streets in Casper, so would that be something to piggyback on in addition to, because clearly we don't have money in this fund to take care of everything, but we are gonna be bringing before the ballot a 6-cent tax. Would that be something to add possibly to that?
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, you guys do wonderful dialogue, and I really appreciate it. I hadn't even thought of that. But the reality is I'd be reluctant to take it forward to all the mayors and the commissioners at this point in the game, because hopefully anyway, they are working on their resolutions that support the current plan with respect to using those dollars only for Midwest, and of course the water line in Midwest and Edgerton. So I would say probably not, but without a doubt, a specific purpose excise tax is a way that a lot of communities fund road projects. Absolutely do. The only other thing I would add, Mr. Mayor, if I could, to Councilmember Pollack's question is, going back to that pie chart, if we could, from a capital standpoint, the other way to free up money kind of on more of an immediate basis would be to look critically at that pie chart and say, well, what is it that we want to defund in order to, fund more appropriately streets, other projects, and so on. And that was kind of the homework that we gave back to you all when we said, go home and look at your capital books, see what you think. We certainly are open to those ideas as well.
Mayor.
Councilman Gamer.
Thank you. Do you have further slides on street? I got the questions, but I want to wait for a more appropriate time.
On streets, I was going to go through the sewer stuff, but it's the exact same
Okay.
concept. We don't need to do that. We can talk more about streets if you'd like.
I do. I always
Andrew's
want
got even a menu that you can get to if you want to hear it.
Yeah, he's got to take me out to dinner or something one of these nights.
Bye.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the work at the Water Fund, exploring all these different ways to fund it. I guess the issue for me is when we talk about reallocating, 1 cent funds, about cash we have on hand, postponing other projects, that to me doesn't feel sustainable, because we need we need $3.5 at least $1 million every year. So putting off one-time projects to me doesn't feel like a sustainable path forward. I'm just really struggling to understand, I don't know how to articulate this. You guys have put together a balanced budget. We're looking at positions that I don't think there's a lot of fat, is what I'm saying. A lot of the public will say, oh, government's bloated, there's all this fat. I think we're down to the meat, and we're trying to decide what limbs to cut off, essentially. As far as the streets go, even if we defunded all of the nonprofit, if we took the $1 million that we give to nonprofits, that's only 1 out of the 3. So we could completely defund nonprofits through 1 cent and still only get 30% of the way that we need to get there. And so I guess I'm just taking a long-range perspective. How do we fix streets? When we showed, beginning of this year, they're 59 out of 100. And what I'm picking up on is kind of a sense of hopelessness that we're never going to reach the 7 million. And so I'm just, thinking 20, 30 years down the road, are we going to be at a 45 out of, like at what point do we reverse that course? Or are we just, at some point, we're going to have to deal with the fact that we're going to be driving on dirt at some point? It's such a big number, the 3.5 million. We can pinch pennies and, cut a few of these positions and get the tens of thousands of dollars, but a sustainable way forward of getting at least $3.5 million every year for streets, I don't see how it's possible. And I imagine if it was possible, we would have talked about it. So I'm feeling a little bit a sense of hopelessness about this. I don't know if Andrew shares it or not, but yeah, I don't know.
Whenever I need to be cheered up, I always look at Andrew.
It's true.
He's full of hope and optimism.
So I guess I would just say that I personally have no interest in putting off one-time projects to try to fund streets. I'm more interested in a sustainable way forward on that. I don't see what that is right now, but
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, don't despair. We have some ideas.
all right.
The long-term answer is the best answer, frankly, because as we were kind of, bouncing around on tonight, the long-term answer is not available in one budget cycle, okay? What we're hoping is that over time, we can extract direct distribution out of the operations of the general fund with a conversion plan that Jill is putting together, and hopefully you'll, like, and it will be doable, right? Once direct distribution is out of there, and the state doesn't change our formula to where those numbers go down over time, that's $3.8 million that could be available for a capital program that we don't have available right now. The other thing is, while we don't have the flexibility of looking at social service agencies that critically right now, you do have the, the luxury of determining how 1 cent 17 is going to be spent. And 1 cent 17 is yours to determine. I mean, that's a unique role for councils because it only comes up every 4 years, right? So you're going to be in that driver's seat. The other side of it is, we have requested that we set aside $11.5 million of what I would consider our unencumbered, unobligated CARES funds. Used to be CARES funds. We think it's lost its identity in that regard. That you could build into a capital agenda over time to deal with streets. We're hoping you don't this year because we'd like to gain that interest income from that pool of money so that we can hopefully see sales tax revenue come back and displace the need for that level of income. But that's a pocket of money too, So I'm trying to give you these things so that you don't despair. We do have some options, and you frankly are in the driver's seat for things that a lot of your those that come after you won't be, at least for the next 4 years.
Councilmember Paul.
So I guess a question for you there. I mean, to me, it feels like this budget strategy gets us one step closer on to that track. Is that accurate?
I sure hope so. That's how I feel about it.
Great.
So be patient.
Councilman now.
What is the percentage of opportunity that CARES money will actually be available for us to not use in that avenue and to be able to pull in to like a capital project like that?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Nell, Jill and I have talked a lot about that. And when we're talking about the CARES dollars specifically, we think the probability is very, very high that those dollars will be available for your use. We're asking for a year to kind of see how the nation looks at those residual dollars. And, we're not on the bleeding edge of that decision making, right? The other thing, though, that I would want to instill in your mind is the idea that ARPA dollars may also be available for these kinds of projects. I don't feel like that is real clear right now. And so I'm also asking for another year to hold those dollars in abeyance until we figure out what the legislative directive is so that we can potentially consider streets.
Well, and as a follow-up, where that's coming from on my part is I guess I just don't want to see us get in a situation with the state who's going to try to grab everything they can and put us in a sales tax situation saying we want that money back. And so that's why I was wondering what's the real opportunity for us to be able to hold on to that or maintain it without them pulling it back from us. So, and I think the year is great anyway because we're getting interest income anyway. So, but I just hope we don't get in that situation like we did with the sales tax.
Right.
Yeah. Come on.
I've also got another thing I want to show you, okay? Because it'll help us maybe in this question, maybe, but it'll definitely help us as it relates to what we want to do with employees moving forward, okay? As we go into the general fund, right, many of you were concerned that this level of sales tax dollars, maybe too high, maybe too aggressive or whatever. I would still stand by the notion that from a historic standpoint, this is not, betting on the come. It's not overly aggressive, you know. I think it's doable. But nonetheless, that is your question to be comfortable with, right, at the end of the day, because you guys approve and pass the budget. Moving on from here, however, I think you understand the role that those dollars play, because without a doubt, they are significant as it relates to this figure right here, okay? And when compared to this figure right here, we are very concerned that this is always greater than that, right? And as you can see, that margin is dang narrow. For a $45 million budget, that is a minuscule margin, right? And so keeping an eye on that is really, really critical if you're trying to live within the means that your budget in the general fund is, is balanced against. 20 million bucks, 19 million bucks for a figure like that, huge. There's your direct distribution dollars right there. We hope to extricate those out of this category over time. We're going to bring a proposal that says we might be able to. This is the chart you saw last time, okay? On Monday night, this lays out the prospectus for the general fund FY22. You've got some money here from a cash basis to look at. And I would suggest these kinds of balances really should only be dealt with on a one-time investment basis as well, because this is just a cash position. From an operational standpoint, I would say let's not mess with that, okay? In terms of decisions we got to make from here on out, that balance is obviously pretty delicate right now, right? In visiting with staff this past 36 hours, they pointed something out to me that they're absolutely correct about. We actually have one more month of revenue receipts due to the general fund. And the reality is we played it conservatively enough that we didn't really rely upon this money coming in, and certainly not this money coming in like up here, you know what I mean, above budget, okay? So with that understanding, the reality is you do have the reasonable expectation of expecting $1.2 million coming into the general fund that could be considered gravy, if you will, for the operations of the general fund. Now, that doesn't improve your operational balance, right? That's still going to remain at 900 bucks, okay? Because that's an FY21 receipt. But it does improve your cash position moving into July 2 of your new fiscal year, okay? So this becomes, the sum of these two numbers becomes your cash position. Now, it doesn't bring $3 million to the streets program, right? But it does give you a little more flexibility in terms of one-time investments you might want to consider. Okay?
Councilman Gamera?
Thank you, Mayor. Clarification, the 1.8 that was there, or yeah, whatever was there before, 1.2. 1.2, okay. We were going to use those funds to pay for, what was it with the employees?
We'll show you. Okay. Let's bring that back if we could, Evan. That original chart. The original chart. This is the original chart right here. There's that 1.2. Mm-hmm. You add these two together, and by the end of the fiscal year, you have that as your cash balance. Mm-hmm. We were proposing getting rid of this obligation, and I should tell you, to assume that we have to pay, that we are allowed to pay nothing against that balance would be incorrect. We will have, what was the number we came up with that we have to pay?
$185,000.
Thank you. You will, the only room you have really is the difference between 603 and 185, okay? We were suggesting that this cash be used to pay off the revolving land fund, because we were worried about an imbalance there against your policy. And then the piece that really generated a lot of conversation was the one-time payment to full-time employees, and we are proposing that this figure actually will be a little more than that, right? We think it'll actually be in the neighborhood of 580,000 versus 567. But that is a one-time payment, not an operational obligation year over year. Okay? So that's what that was.
Thank you for the reminder.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you. I have to tell you, my whole conservative approach to this was based off of looking at this budget. I know you hate that word, I'm sorry. That's where I'm at.
It's gonna trigger him now.
But I have beat this budget into oblivion over the last week. And I came up with the $900, and that's where the stretch was for me to spend $1 million on employees, because I'm like, we are too close to the vest on this, and I wasn't liking it. Now, and I don't know how the hell I missed that, but that additional money makes this a very simple equation for me. It was just too close for me and too close for comfort. And I know this is what you do every day, but so do I. And so as I'm beating myself up with this, I don't know how I missed the other $1 million that your people found. I don't know how you missed it, but I'm glad they found it.
Yeah.
It sure gives me a lot more comfort in wanting to do this. I just feel way better about it. It gives me a lot more comfort in, and I will tell you also, while we're on the subject of the employees, I personally like the one time. I don't like the payment to the employees. I'm all about that. I don't like creating an issue for us down the road that we may or may not be able to cover. So I mean, this just feels so much better to me. And I'm sorry for all the questions earlier. I'm sorry for beating on you, but I mean, this is what I do, and I feel this is just a whole different. I don't know what to tell you. I'm on your side now, I guess.
Well, I appreciate that. And so that you're abundantly clear with regard to what happens when we inject that funding in there. Remember, this balance is still very, very delicate as it relates to the operations. But in terms of this figure here, Evan, why don't you show them what happens? Wait for it.
That is
Crunch him again.
I was hoping for some dynamic movement.
That's a lot nicer to look at.
So this becomes your new cash position. Last time it was $19,000.
Assuming we pay our sales tax back in full.
Assuming all of this, that's right. You've got positions, you've got the implementation of the graves, and you have these individual entries as well to still leave you a balance of 1.2 to work with as you get into the new fiscal year.
And if you don't pay all the sales tax and you pay the minimum payment, that's only going to go up
Exactly.
$400,000, or
That's
not even
exactly
that.
right. Right.
So.
Right.
Councilwoman Lutz.
So, and it's must be a generational thing. The millennial in me has a really hard time paying back money that we don't have to and that we're basically getting for free. And I tell everyone every year, like, why would you get yourself in a tax refund position? You're letting the government borrow your money for free. Don't let people borrow your money for free. So I guess my point is, what is like the advantage to paying that sales tax off? Is it just to get it off the books and off our worries, or is there like maybe some kind of like negotiation on some other item with the state that we're hoping to use as leverage?
Very fair question. I appreciate you asking that. The Gen Xer in me says debt is bad, right?
Yes.
The terms are very favorable. I agree.
Yes.
But I've never been one to recommend sustaining debt.
Yeah.
Except when you're talking about doing major rehabs on a water treatment plant or a sewer
Right.
plant or whatever. Bonding is that's not a bad option. I would be hard pressed to say that by sustaining this debt over the next 3 years, which is the term of our agreement with the state, I think, 2 years, 3 years, that you're going to incur a bunch of costs to do that, right? I can't make that argument, admittedly. I will tell you, though, that having this balance of funds available, particularly in light of the fact that we do think we're going to have that available, really doesn't get you much.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to throw $400,000 at Andrew for a street project. It'll get you a part of the street.
Yeah.
So the value for me is better to get that out of our hair, get the state, taken care of, and particularly when you compare what it is that we actually have to pay back and the remaining residual of dollars for a $45 million budget doesn't make a lot of sense.
And it's not like we're letting the government use our money. That's their money.
It's their money.
No, you're good. I just wasn't
It's
sure
all
if this was
loans
like a negotiation thing of like we're trying to talk to them about something else, therefore we want this out of the weeds. I just wasn't sure if there were more pieces to the puzzle short of just getting it done.
No, this is pretty
Okay.
straightforward. Yeah.
I concur as a Gen Xer.
Would it also be
It's
better
'cause they're
to
not
pay it while we
dragons.
have
Yeah,
the money
exactly.
instead of
You
worrying
don't
about
understand.
You
how to
don't
pay the
understand.
debt a year or two down the
You-
road
you
when we may or may
think so
not
bad.
have the money?
You
yet.
ready for your
Yeah.
okay boomer statement?
Yeah.
I go along with his Gen X as a
Hey,
boomer.
look
Get rid of debt.
I miss the okay boomer cues like every time. So
I wanted to give you a heads up. Go ahead, you say.
It would be awful tough to try to budget it next year and the year after if we're
Yeah.
really low on funds. So if we have
Yep.
the money, just wipe it out.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that as a summer child.
Oh my God.
I'll support you wanting to pay that off, though.
Yeah.
I still believe that, like, get rid of debt, sure, but if that doesn't cost you any money, then that's not a bad thing. So, I will go along with the will of the group on that, but
Me too.
I'm a millennial, so like I'm accustomed to a lot of debt.
We live in it.
Yeah, we just have debt all the time. Very comfortable with debt, so
This is what we do.
yeah.
No, thank you.
No, debt is
Free
bad.
debt, especially
Must be so
free debt,
nice when
man.
college,
Love
Exactly,
was
college,
$500 a year.
We didn't have that luxury.
It took some of us 20 years to pay off our college loans too.
It'll take me 8, so
Debt-free when I graduated from college.
I'll be dead.
I don't
Councilman
have any,
Gamera.
No, I don't have any questions. I'm ready. Yeah.
it.
All questioned out.
So, Mr. Mayor, with respect to the proposal for the general fund, this is what we would recommend. We are not recommending anything right now in these categories, but I would like to put the sticky note, if you will, on this topic 6 months from now, so that if there is a possibility, if there is revenue that comes in on an operational basis that helps us feel a little more comfortable, if you'll at least give me the opportunity to have the conversation, I appreciate it.
Councilman, no.
We did, your budget did include a COLA, I thought, a one-time,
No.
oh, it's a bonus.
It's
Yeah,
a
it's a
one-time
bonus.
payment.
And that's right
COLA
here.
is
That's
across
just
the
right
board
there.
forever. Yeah.
Gotcha.
What it does include, though, Mr. Mayor, Councilman, is the grave study. This number does include the grave study that we just heard about.
127.
Councilman Gamera.
Thank you. The $1,000 bonus, was that to recoup for? I'm sorry. What's that?
900.
900 each.
Oh, 900. Sure. Was that to recoup? They're not getting raises over the past year, or is that to, is that for this coming year, or was that for the last year? I guess is because they didn't get raises last year, and so this bonus would be, hey, here's a bonus now for the raise you didn't get last year. Or is it here's a bonus now? You may get raises this year, I guess.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Gamroth, the reality is we've really had a 5-year cycle of ups and downs in being able to invest in our employees. During that period, one COLA has been extended, and I think it was 1.5%. I would tell you that cost of living has gone up over that period of time, and so I would say that we're probably behind on that curve. But the other reality is we've also had more than one period where we have not been able to get our employees progressing through their wage band, whether it's graves or non-graves. We've had to, prevent that movement from occurring. And, while I certainly understand why that is, I feel like a one-time investment of that nature, at least in the general fund here, is a vote of confidence in our employees. It's an acknowledgement that things haven't been ideal, and we're trying to get a little money in their pockets, even though it's not as good as a raise.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Lutz.
The accountant and me can't not bring this up, but just so everyone remembers, this is $900 net to the employee.
Correct.
Yes.
So what that means is the city's taking on the FICA, basically Social Security, Medicare, and federal withholding. which, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, bothers me a tiny bit because federal withholding can vary significantly between employees. A single 22-year-old is probably having almost, very little or maybe a lot, whatever, withheld from his paycheck versus, somebody who has later in life and 4 kids and a spouse and all these kind of things. And so to me it is slightly unequitable, the fact that the city covers that federal withholding, because obviously, you'd almost be advantaged to be already withholding more because the city's going to cover that for you versus already withholding less. But either way, just be clear, that's not just pure wages. We're also paying both sides of the payroll tax.
Absolutely. And Mr. Mayor, I might add as a kind of a balancing statement with regard to that, $900 is going to mean a lot more to a single employee
Yes.
than $900 will mean to a person with kids at home and a wife to support, stuff like that, or a spouse to support, or whatever. So there is that. So no way's perfect.
I would
Yeah.
think it would all be welcome though, wouldn't you?
I absolutely think it would be.
Yeah.
I think it would be.
Mm-hmm.
I hope it will be.
Yeah.
So that's the proposal for the general fund. Unless council would like to see a lot of variations with that, we're prepared to walk you through those. But if council's good to go, then we won't need to go into any other exercises in that regard.
You good to go? Okay.
Okay? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. We do have other things we need to follow up with you on, not near as time consuming, but a couple questions we wanted to answer for you tonight. In the event that you wanted to give different direction or whatever. Do you want to hear what Andrew was going to do with that extra $3 million in streets?
Yeah, I'm curious.
It's mixed reviews, Mr. Mayor.
He's so sad.
Mayor, when Carter said he looks to me for a ray of sunshine kind of, I'm very hesitant to pass this out actually because it is so dependent. If you take $3 million away from utilities, the capital for streets changes too, because I cannot replace a street where I've got a utility underneath that needs replaced, and all of a sudden they go, "You took my money." So there's a dynamic there as well. But I will pass this out just so you have an idea, but it is considered draft. So if you go, "Hey Beamer, why didn't you do Crescent Avenue?" It was on your list. Because it is draft.
Well, I don't want you to go out and replace the street and next year dig it up to replace the water
That's
line.
exactly right. So keep in mind, we have $550,000 allocated for fiscal year '22 going to finish off Industrial Avenue. We've got $125,000 allocated to Farnham to work with replacement of the storm sewer. So we've got essentially a balance of miscellaneous street money of $2.5 million for fiscal year '22, unless you add the $3 million that is going to water and sewer. So the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are what we could possibly fund with a balance of 2.5. And the remaining
From
projects,
water and streets?
what's that?
From water and streets at 2.5 from?
No, from miscellaneous, or available still to miscellaneous
I
streets.
thought that was 3.5.
The second portion is what we could fund if we allocate the $3 million that was going to streets, to utilities to streets.
So the 2.5 is what you're gonna do already, the 3
Draft.
draft, right, sorry, draft.
Yes.
Improvement, alteration, I get you.
Yes. And underneath the solid, the bold line is what we could possibly afford to do if you reallocated the $3 million from utilities to streets. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you should see at the very bottom, roughly a total of $5.5 million. If that, does that kind of make sense?
What is the PCI, with,
That is the pavement condition index. So
that's a 59 out of 100?
correct. That's what
Overall?
we're currently sitting at
Yeah.
currently. So again, I'm glad I can be your ray of sunshine, because I know Carter can be kind of dour. So. But that is the very draft list that I've yet to even share with utilities, and they may go, you're killing me. We cannot afford to replace the utilities, but they have to be done on the street, and we will then adjust our capital accordingly to work hand in hand with utilities to replace water and sewer at the same time we replace the street, if that makes sense.
And the higher the number, the better the street.
Yeah, and again, I got this list maybe 3:30 this afternoon, and I vetted it very quickly. I took 2 projects off, and you see all of Durbin and Walcott. No doubt those would get scaled back just to the worst sections. So again, draft.
Chapter the watermark.
So does this have anything to do with bizarre things where we have like below zero and then the sewer lines are all busting everywhere like we had earlier this year? And does this budget affect
No.
that?
That is what some of that $2.5 million that goes to the water fund would help to fix the underlying water main and then to patch back that street. That does not come out of the miscellaneous streets fund. That is a capital, and that is a enterprise expense.
Okay.
Carter, is it possible for us to even consider taking the money from water to do this? I mean, literally, is it even considerable?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, the way that it's considerable in my mind is if you are comfortable manipulating the capital agenda on the water side, so that rates don't have to get crazy in order to bring that blue curve back to where it needs to be. Meaning do less in capital in water.
Improve streets.
In order to free
further
up
degrade water.
money for streets. And that's obviously a very deep policy decision on your part.
Councilmember Paul.
Is it fair to say, though, that at the staff level, you've already weighed the pros and cons of that sort of trade-off and presented us with your best recommendations?
Mr. Mayor, council member, I like to think so, but the truth is, council policy weighs very, very heavily in many, many aspects of the budget. This would be one of those if it needed to be different.
Well, I mean, surely I could say, like, I like streets, but like that, I don't know what the condition of the sewer is. I can tell the condition of the street because I drive on it, and so it's an easier thing for me to say, like, well, yeah, we should definitely prioritize that, but there are people who understand both, like Andrew. So I assume that, like, you've already thought through and made a recommendation based on what you know of all conditions of all of these things.
Mayor, council, we don't invest probably enough in water, sewer, or streets.
Sure.
Keep in mind that the current funding with water right now, we are averaging, we can replace a water main once every 200 years?
Yep.
250 years?
Right.
And at our current investment in the sewer fund, once every 300 years?
Mm-hmm. That makes me feel
So,
good.
by no,
We did.
Not my problem.
we are not investing extravagantly in either of those enterprise funds either. So, just to put that in some kind of perspective.
Yeah.
Councilman Gamero.
Thank you, Mayor. So yeah, Andrew reminded me, I know I've been all about the streets, but I'm just using streets because it's an easy example. We don't fund any of our infrastructure at the, so I guess when we were talking earlier about where to find the $3 million for streets, I'd love to do that. But that's one, we need to find the $1 million for stormwater, we need to find the millions of dollars for sewer, and so that's where my worry is looking at all of our infrastructure being chronically underfunded. It just, like, that seems like a monumental lift, and I don't know how we reverse course. Maybe we can patch something together to focus on streets, but stormwater, sewer, all that stuff is still going downhill too. So.
Councilman Nell.
Thank you, Mayor. It seems to me that if we're gonna get there, we're going to have to pass some of this on to our constituents, and we're gonna have to literally lower our subsidies. And if that means our water bills go up $1 a month, then that's what it means. But I don't know how else we get there if we don't do that, and I think that's a discussion we have to talk about tonight, isn't it? Isn't that part of this?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman Nell, it depends on how tolerant council wants to be of the current agenda in terms of investing in streets and water and sewer. If council just says we can't do that, we need more money in streets, let's make it happen, then what we would do is we would alter the capital agenda in water and sewer so that you don't have to come forward, you know, like November with a 20% increase in rates or whatever. So without a doubt, we can make those policy directives happen. But the response would have to be, from our standpoint, here's what you need to do in water and sewer in order to, you know, have a more moderate increase over time with respect to trying to recover those costs. Invariably, that's what we would do in response.
Councilmember Bullock?
Seems to me, I agree, but it seems to me that the course of action is to move forward with the budget we have and then really dig into this when we talk about rates, so that our next budget, we may be able to free up some funds to start even moving further in this direction.
It's definitely a multi-year
Right, so
solution,
it'll
yeah.
be, you know, step by step, but we don't, yeah, to me, that's the strategy. We move forward here, rather than try to reallocate out of one area that we're just gonna have to try to backfill later. Like, move forward with what we have, and then really be thinking about what next year's budget is going to look like when it comes time to talk about rates. And 1 cent, and how we structure 1 cent.
Councilman Kelly?
I was gonna say, you brought it up right there at the tail end, is potentially look at how we go into the 1 cent 17 project and how we sell it on what that money is gonna be spent for. Is that we may wind up saying that, yes, we may cut $500,000 out of the social programs, and we may cut something out of some other programs, that this is where we need to be, and give the citizens, only we can't do it. It has to be done by private, because we can't put on the campaign ourselves.
Right.
But basically get with the 1 cent committee and say that, you know, we used to give them a list of specific projects we were going to do. Then we turned around and said, no, here's a survey, where do you want the money spent? And we may need to do a combination of those, but show them that, hey, here is where we need money to get streets back up. Tell the citizenry that we're only replacing water lines once every 200 years, and do a better job of that to let them understand that we may not be giving some of the money to the library or, you know, wherever, that this is where we need to be now, and these are some of our more primary functions. So I think you're absolutely down the right road there.
So as far as some other homework questions, we have prepared a memo for you from the chief that talks about immediate needs that his current facility situation is requiring some attention for. We can just have you read it passively, or we can have the chief walk you through it. Totally up to you. The other memo that you have is from Mr. Cortez, wherein he identifies for you the differences between our irrigation schedule that we are proposing in FY22 and the irrigation schedule that we proposed in FY21. And so you can see the values that those kinds of approaches bring to the table. And we can have them go through that with you too, or you can read it passively, whatever you like. Those are the documents that we've given you there.
Can I ask the chief a question? So this is for your existing locations.
That is correct.
Does all of this go away if we move forward with a different location?
Mayor, Councilwoman, you know, so even under a best case scenario, a different location takes time. And I do have some immediate needs, that some of which has already been submitted for council consideration. I've identified those in here. That's got some sub bullet points that identifies those for you. the police department is well on its way to achieving international accreditation. But we have some infrastructure problems that are denying that progress right now. That they have to be fixed before we would be in non-compliance, and it would overrule our ability to become accredited. We want to be able to face our citizens and say, we don't just think we're good. Outside credible people think that we're good. And so I tried to delineate some of those for you. Those are those critical things that need to be addressed regardless. Is the condition of the impound lot needs to be addressed. We have some renovations we got to do with how we process and control our evidence and our property that we come into possession of that belongs to citizens. May I see that real quick? I want to make sure I don't miss anything. The drying rooms that's a critical thing. Regardless of all other things notwithstanding, that has to be done. For me to retain my, the ability to produce evidence that can be admitted into court. And then one of the things that is already partially funded, but which has been augmented recently, and we've already had the discussion tonight on the need for me to have a police video redaction specialist in there. But in addition to that, I got to have a place before I get us engaged in unintended lawsuits. I got to have a place where I can bring in people to inspect these video records, and I got to do it in a private viewing area. So that's one of the things that's just critical for us. I need to avoid the potentiality of lawsuits, and that in addition to that, redaction specialist also is a room that's got to be.
Do you have a closet handy? An extra closet?
Those are all full.
We used all of our closets. So there's a portion of that remodel of the front lobby. And as I've indicated in there, I've already been in negotiations to reduce our cost in that on a property we don't own and that I am just leasing. I've entered into just the preliminary negotiations of, look, you may inherit it in the future. These are renovations you would do anyway. Do you mind splitting the thing with me? And they've been absolutely open. They claim at my level that they are in approval of that. That obviously has to go before their elected board also. So I've done everything I can to, as I repeatedly said to this council and the prior council, I despise every nickel I put into these properties because I believe it to be a complete and utter waste. And so we are very conservative with the things that we bring to you. Look, we can't live without making these changes. So much of this boils down to our efficacy in prosecutions and avoiding litigation.
If I can just add to it, the reason I asked if there were projects now is because this can has been kicked for years. If you go look over at the Hall of Justice on the side of it, I think it's 1976 or 77 or whenever, but it was in the 70s that building was built, and that's the last time the police department has been given any new space whatsoever, and they've needed it forever. And we have them spread out all over the place, and nothing is to say that a new police station is going to come about anytime soon. We hope it does, and but nothing says that's going to happen. So by doing nothing, we're not helping the situation out any, and I agree. I think we're putting money into areas that we'll probably never get back, but at the same time, they need to be able to do their job and do it correctly and not be hampered. So, I wouldn't be surprised if the rooms aren't out in the hallway because there is just no room, and the closets are all being used. So, Councilmember Paul.
I'm looking at, for instance, the creation of the private video viewing room that you were indicating that could be split, and I'm also seeing that our share of that would be $27,000 approximately, and we've got something already in the budget for $21,900. Is that something that difference, say that negotiation is achieved, that difference is something that we could, if it's not in the budget currently, we've got those 2 point whatever million it came out to be for one-time projects. Is that how we would approach that through the coming year? Would it come to us as a one-time project for some of these things if they're not currently in the budget to say like we can, or we can make an amendment, or what's the process?
Mr. Mayor, council member, there's a couple ways that you can go about doing that. Certainly, as you take in this data and consume it and read it and feel good about it and so on, without a doubt, council can direct us to allocate one-time dollars to one-time investments like this.
And we could do that now, as part of the budget, as it is.
Absolutely, the budget process now. If in fact, you know, you have kind of a mixed view about some of this and would like to come back at it when those needs start to present themselves over time, yes, an amendment would be the right way to go should you want to fund something outside of this process we're in right now.
Okay.
Without a doubt. Mr. Mayor, on the screen here, in an answer to another question about the possibility of selling assets, this is one asset that I would recommend might be of interest to the private sector. This is the corner of Trevitt Lane and Robertson Road. And all that land in that polygon is land that the city owns. That's about 9 acres. And we over the years, we have had questions from various representatives of the private sector to say, you know, can we get that land? Can we do this? And so forth. I think that the private sector would like to see that on the market.
Yeah.
And so my recommendation would be, if you have the tolerance for wanting to go through that process, to look at putting this on the market. That'd be one recommendation. Another recommendation that we would offer is this land here that is south of the current Starbucks on Center Street. All of those properties in yellow are properties that the city of Casper currently owns. I happen to think that the private sector would like to have that as well. I think that would have some interest with the private sector. That'd be another recommendation that I would propose. And then finally, the piece of property that is currently being released to the private sector, and in fact you'll see that happen this week, is this piece of property near the Mesa West development off of Central, that obviously a large part of which is not developed at this point in time. That is property that previously council has given the blessing to put on the market and see what we get from the private sector as an offer. And that should be happening this week.
How big is that one, Carter?
How big is that one, Ms. Becker?
I think it's 7.
7 acres? So one thing I would tell you is none of that, with the exception of this piece of property right here, is being banked on as bringing money into the financial mix of anything that's been offered to you so far for your consideration.
I just feel like this is the right thing to do, just because we're doing a lot of asking, police station and things of that nature. So I think that for the public to see that we're doing our best to try to help cover some of this without holding onto property to offset some of the costs, I think that it would be received well.
Councilwoman.
So obviously I know that there's probably a lot of policy things involved, but I know a handful of times since I've been here, typically speaking, when we're talking about selling like lands and buildings, the proceeds have gone into the revolving land fund.
Right.
And obviously, you know, that's storing up funds for like future purchases, whether that's land or buildings. Is that basically like written into policy, or is that kind of like a per sale decision that we're making?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, without a doubt, council has the total authority to decide where any of these funds go.
Okay.
Our policy directive, we believe, would be to funnel these into the revolving land fund.
Yep.
But you could tell us whatever you'd like.
Okay.
Yep. So, I'm sorry.
Councilmember Polk.
I agree with, I don't think we should hold on to land that we don't have a good purpose for holding on to, generally speaking. So if we had some sort of strategy or something that we were envisioning for these spots, I think, you know, maybe not sell them, but is it true too, like, we wouldn't change this year's budget based on speculation that we might be able to sell these within the next year, because we wouldn't bank on that, right, for this year's budget?
Mr. Mayor, council member, the only exception to that I would completely agree with would be this right here.
Okay.
And we did account for some level of revenue coming into the revolving land fund contingent with this sale happening.
Yeah. I guess I would say, like,
But that's it.
as a general philosophy, I don't disagree with trying to offload some of these properties, but doesn't change my, like, outlook on the current budget that we have.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Mayor, with the council's blessing, we'll move forward on all three, if that's okay.
I think it's the time.
I do too. And then with that, Mr. Mayor, we had one more question that we wanted to tackle as a feature of last meeting's discussion. Councilwoman Ingebretson asked about the possibility of dealing with some of the issues in the current health plan. And in particular, I believe she was asking about some of the more largely unfunded portions of the health plan that the employer is obligated to cover, if I'm understanding correctly. And the reality is, particularly as it relates to the employee's selection of only, is it dental and life? Is that what it is? Dental and life. That is a very clearly unfunded, unshared cost between the employer and the employee. The challenge is twofold. One is we're not totally sure that the health plan actually allows us to charge secondary fees, if you will, to our employees who have selected that option, even though it costs us $23,000 a month to provide that option by virtue of the design of the plan. The other part of it is, though, that with respect to the actual cost of that plan, in relation to what we actually have to pay as a result of what the plan requires, we would only stand to get, what did we say, $100 from each employee if they cover the total cost of that benefit. So the reality of that employee contribution offsetting that cost obligation that the employer has is very, very minimal, and probably not worth the juice that the squeeze would require. So we wouldn't recommend it because it just doesn't bring much to the table.
Is that $100 a month or a year?
Mr. Mayor, that would be the maximum benefit we could expect to get in that scenario would be $100 a month. The $23,000 is our cost per month as well.
I can't imagine what that would do to our employees if we went back to them and said, hey, you know what I mean? To me, it's not worth
Private
it.
employee.
It chews up to
It's-
$900.
Well, it's not worth the lack of benefit that we're giving them. That just doesn't seem right to me.
And I think that's all the homework we had. Mr. Mayor, members of the council.
Is it questions?
Just one comment, if I may. I got to tell you, I feel much more comfortable about this budget. I was, as you know, very apprehensive. I talked to you today about it, but I beat myself up on this, just like I'm sure you did. I hope you understand where I was coming from, Carter. Like I said, I'm all about it. So I'm much happier with it, much more comfortable with it. And as far as I'm concerned, you have my blessing.
Thank you.
I guess, Carter, I want to clarify a few things, because I don't think anybody said anything, but the irrigation and water, is everybody good with staying where we are?
That was Kyle's question about the watering. No, I'm just saying it was, so you'd be the one
Oh,
to.
you're talking about parks and stuff?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, so what do you, we have?
Stay here.
I see, I didn't even see that, thank you. Everyone else already look at that, you all waiting on me, or?
Does this include the cemetery? Because I know that last year there was some public concern about perceived disrespect of not having the cemetery.
It does not.
Okay.
And for purposeful reasons. Yeah.
Thank you.
Correct.
I'll just weigh in.
Vice
I'm
Mayor Pacheco.
I'm fine with staying with that, what we have proposed at this point right now. I know you guys have already made significant, we did last year anyway, and so, you know, I'm okay with it, and that's where I stand on it, and it sounds like it. Not to put any pressure, Kyle, or anything like that.
I agree with Vice Mayor Pacheco.
Yeah, I would say maybe for one more year to see like what
Yeah.
the impacts of that are in a non-pandemic time, and just kind of get a sense of if it causes problems, if it doesn't cause problems, then I think I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
I'm also fine with waiting. You know, I'm only 4 months deep, so I don't want to come in here guns blazing. You know, I would like to remain a little bit humble and learn as I go. But if the consequences are mostly aesthetics, I'm a very practical, utility-driven person. So if that's the only thing holding us up from saving a few $100,000, you know, I'm willing to wait for the next year. But you know, that's where I come from. I'm a very functional, utility-driven guy.
Councilwoman Lutz.
But I think a good point was brought up that maybe where we go forward with it is looking into making the parks more natural landscaped as far as solid green grass is not natural here. And so maybe what it is, you know, a year from now we have homework of making the parks less maintenance heavy.
Councilman
My
Nutt.
assumption is a lot of the watering is for the actual ball fields, the outfields and everything else, and so there's more than just aesthetics involved. There are balls coming off of bats at 100 miles an hour.
Right.
And if they're not hitting soft grass and they're hitting a piece of dirt or a rock, you're in trouble. So there's a lot more to it than just aesthetics, just so you know. And my hope is that, Tim, I don't know, with that limited amount of watering, I hope we can keep it green and at least somewhat safe and soft somehow.
So, sorry, Bruce, not to cut you off. 26,000 was for athletics, right? That's for our fields. So the athletic fields represent 70, 220, 240, 10% or something like that.
So the rest of it is just
Seems parks maintenance and special areas, which I guess I don't know exactly what special areas is.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, special areas are kind of like the main thing would be the planters you see up and down, say, 2nd Street.
okay.
Some of our smaller parks, you know, I shouldn't call them a park then, it's a special area. Say it's got a statue around it, and it's got like a green area that sits around it, we irrigate it. That would be considered a special area. We have almost 100 of them in the city in total.
Does that include like the strip on CY, Tim? Where the trees and the
Yep,
grass and
that
all
would be
that?
a
Median there?
perfect example, yes, sir.
That's an area. If you mention it, I don't see many kids playing at that
It's a
park.
special area.
All right, so we're good and
Yeah, I'm too exhausted up here to devote much. I'm fine for this next, you know, exploring it again next year.
all right. And then the other thing is, as the chief was explaining, he explained what he needed, but we didn't talk about it. So, thoughts on that, Councilmember Paul?
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of this is relatively nominal in the cost. I'm especially in favor of getting some of this equipment needed for the evidence drying room. That was one of the bigger red flags that I saw when I was going through the tour.
Old mop closet is what you're using right now, right?
Yeah, I just think like that's a disservice to everyone in our community. It's not only opening us for lawsuits, but it's just not fair to the accused either to not have, you know, a secure room for evidence. So and a, you know, appropriate room. So the only one that gives me a little bit of hesitation is the larger ticket item, the $225 for the lot. I'm wondering if maybe we put that off. It looks like there's some things that are going to be done right away. Maybe we can revisit that as the year goes. But the other ones, I mean, we're less than $100,000 for everything else.
So total on this was $241,600. And to talk about the lot in particular, I can tell you from my experience that lot gets broken into a lot by people that their cars are there and they want to get things back. So in the middle of the night while the police are out doing their thing, not at their lot like they shouldn't be, people are breaking in and taking things out of there.
Yeah.
So that has been a problem because I've been gone like 5 years and it was a problem back then and it still is today. So I think
assume
it's
that costs us money every time that happens as well. I mean, I would imagine there are.
Chief, I guess I should.
I just feel like I need to address a statement you made. I didn't want the press or somebody in the room to think incorrectly. Our evidence is secure.
It's secure. I'm
You
sorry.
know.
I don't mean
Yeah, so
insecure.
I wanted
yeah.
to make sure that we're not,
Thank you, yes.
implying that we've been trampling on the rights of
No,
the accused or
no.
something. The evidence is secure, but we're very limited in the amount, the quantity that we
Yes.
can do because I don't have the room to do it.
Sure.
So we have to be I have to farm it out to other people to do it because I only have room for one occurrence, a couple of pieces.
Sure.
So it is secure.
Sure. Thanks for that
I just didn't want that to be the headline. Police department
Throwing
evidence is trampling on the rights of the citizens.
Thank you.
Maybe I need to do more clarifying, so I appreciate
I tried, it doesn't help.
I-
You
yeah,
usually just dig deeper.
I'm glad the mayor brought it back up. I'm in support of it, and I think this would be a good opportunity for us to give some stopgap measures to help out the police department until we figure out building something down the road, and so I'm good with that. I don't think it gives Carter too much heartburn, so I think we can do this.
Councilman Gamro?
Thank you, Mayor. For instance, we do move forward relocating the police department, these improvements that we're making to, say, the marathon lot, when we, if we were to not need that property anymore, would these improvements help improve, would it appraise at a higher value after these improvements?
Good question.
The answer is yes. The answer is yes.
Absolutely, and Mayor, councilman, yes, the answer is yes. I mean, I'm not a realtor, that's up against the railroad. It's, it may be a property that will continue to have use for the city for a longer time. Right now, it's losing its use if we don't fix these things. I have a huge drainage issue that the whole thing is going to collapse pretty quick, and if I don't fix that, then it has no value to the city. I feel compelled to maintain its value to the city, at the same time accomplish the public safety goals that I have for it. So I chose my words carefully. I hope that answered your question. The true answer is yes. These are definite improvements on it. With a lot of this price tag is the security of it. That keeps me from having to pay out some claims, which we have done some large ones.
Yeah. So, good? Moving forward? Okay.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, without a doubt, from this point until the second business meeting in June, you have the authority, of course, and the latitude to ask questions, have more discussion as you need it, and so on. Without a doubt, though, the closer we get to that second business meeting in June, the difficulty level rises in terms of being able to accomplish major initiatives to alter what we've just shared with you for the last 2 or so days. So please keep that in mind, but also be totally aware we are here to try to do everything we can to give you information and make adjustments as we possibly can. So thank you for your discussion. This was a very, very good, productive discussion over the last 2 days, and I really appreciate the conversation and the interest. Thank you.
Okay.
And the support. Thank you.
Anybody got anything else?
Thank you, staff.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody,
Next
for being here.
Tuesday?
Yeah. What day
Next
is it?
Tuesday?
Where are we?
Tuesday, yeah.